You're standing in a village square that looks too quiet for war. The stones beneath your feet are damp with morning mist, and the bakery door has just opened, releasing the warm scent of flour and firewood into the cool air. A bicycle leans against the iron handle of the well. Someone is drawing water. Someone else is counting coins in the palm of their hand. The church bell has not yet rung, but the village is waking in careful sounds. For a moment, everything feels ordinary. Before we continue deeper into these hidden networks, take a moment to settle into the quiet rhythm of the story. If you find calm in journeys like this through the quieter corners of history, take a moment to subscribe, and let us know where you're listening from, or which moment stays with you the most. You're listening to Echoes of War. The houses surrounding the square have stood here for generations. Their pale stone walls hold the warmth of many summers and the silence of many winters. The narrow streets still follow the same paths carved by farmers and merchants long before anyone imagined that war might pass through them. Yet the square remembers something that happened earlier this morning. A truck passed before dawn. Boots touched the stones where you now stand. The engine idled beside the church wall while soldiers studied the road leading toward the valley. Then the vehicle moved on, leaving only a thin ribbon of dust and the quiet understanding that the village now lives inside a different kind of mourning. The war has arrived here. But the resistance you are about to witness does not begin with guns, explosions, or shouted orders. It begins with women walking through this square carrying bread. This is the story of the women of the French Maquis. You watch the village wake slowly, as though it has done so for centuries without interruption. Windows open. A curtain lifts. The sound of water drawn from the pump echoes faintly through the narrow street. A woman steps out carrying a basket against her hip, her shoes touching the stones with a rhythm that belongs to daily life rather than history. She pauses beside the well and glances once toward the empty road. Then she continues walking toward the bakery. Nothing about her movement suggests urgency. The war has taught people here that urgency attracts attention, and attention has become something to avoid. German patrols sometimes travel this road. Military trucks occasionally appear where farm carts once passed without question. The villagers have learned to let the rhythm of ordinary life absorb these changes without protest. To resist openly would invite destruction. So the village continues its quiet routine beneath a sky that has begun to feel uncertain. The forest receives movement differently than a village road. Sound does not travel in straight lines here. It folds into the branches, settles beneath the moss, and disappears into layers of leaves that have gathered through seasons long before the war arrived. When the bicycle enters deeper beneath the trees, the world becomes quieter in a way that feels deliberate, as though the forest itself has learned to hold its voice. She rides slowly now. The trail curves around roots that push through the soil like old bones, forcing the bicycle to weave carefully between them. Sunlight filters down in broken patches, shifting across the ground as the wind moves through the canopy. Each turn of the wheels feels measured, not hurried, not hesitant, simply careful. In places like this, care has become a form of protection. You watch the trail narrow until it barely resembles a road at all. It is little more than a memory of footsteps pressed into the earth over time. Farmers once used this path to reach distant fields. Children once followed it while gathering chestnuts in autumn. Now it serves another purpose, one that the trees seem willing to conceal. After several minutes, the bicycle slows to a stop. She dismounts without noise and leans the frame against a fallen trunk. The forest remains still around her, though somewhere deeper among the branches another sound begins to emerge. It is faint at first, barely more than the shift of leaves underfoot, but it carries the quiet rhythm of people moving with intention rather than accident. Two figures appear between the trees. They do not approach immediately. For a moment they remain where they are, watching the small clearing with the patience of those who have learned that safety often depends on waiting one breath longer than expected. When they step forward, the distance between them closes without greeting. No one speaks. The woman in the grey coat removes the folded paper again and holds it out. One of the figures takes it carefully, unfolding the message while the other continues watching the trail behind her. The exchange lasts only a few seconds. When the paper is finished, it is folded again and tucked away into another pocket where it will remain hidden until it is needed elsewhere. If someone had followed the bicycle from the village, they might struggle to understand what they were witnessing. Nothing about the moment resembles the stories that will one day be told about resistance. There are no raised voices, no dramatic gestures. Only three people standing quietly among trees, sharing information that will travel farther than any of them might go themselves. The forest returns to silence as quickly as it was disturbed. The two figures disappear first, slipping between the trunks with the ease of those who know the terrain well. The woman in the grey coat waits a moment longer before retrieving her bicycle. When she turns back toward the trail, her movements carry the same calm rhythm that brought her here in the first place. The message has already begun its journey. Across occupied France, thousands of small actions like this unfold each day without witness. Some occur in cities where narrow streets hide hurried footsteps between buildings scarred by war. Others take place in fields where farmers pause beside fences long enough to pass along a whispered instruction. And many, like this one, move quietly through forests where the resistance has begun to take root among the trees. The people who carry these messages rarely speak of themselves as fighters. Most are farmers' daughters, students, teachers, or shopkeepers whose lives once followed predictable paths through villages and towns scattered across the countryside. When the occupation arrived, those paths did not disappear. They simply began to overlap with something new, a hidden network of observation, memory, and movement that slowly connected people who had never expected to play any role in war. You begin to understand how resistance grows in places like this. Not through sudden uprising, but through patience. Through repeated gestures so ordinary they rarely attract attention. A bicycle ride along a country road, a visit to a neighbor's house, a walk through the forest at an hour when most people remain indoors. Each action carries its own quiet purpose, linking one village to another until the countryside itself becomes threaded with invisible lines of communication. At first, these connections are fragile. A single arrest can break them. A careless word spoken in the wrong room can lead soldiers to a door before dawn. The people who move within the network know this. They feel the weight of it in every decision they make. Yet the system continues to grow because each small act of cooperation strengthens the next. The woman in the grey coat returns to the road by mid-morning. The village looks almost unchanged from when she left. The bakery line has dissolved. Children chase one another along the edge of the square, while an old man sweeps dust from the steps of the church. Somewhere nearby a radio plays music that drifts faintly through an open window. Life moves forward as though nothing unusual has occurred, and in many ways, nothing visible has. That is the quiet strength of what is forming here. Resistance in rural France does not begin with declarations or banners. It begins with observation. People watching the roads more carefully than before. People remembering the schedules of trains, the movements of patrols, the names of strangers who pass through town asking questions. These fragments of knowledge travel slowly at first, carried from one person to another through trust that builds over time. Women often stand at the center of these early networks. Their presence in daily life allows them to move through occupied spaces without the same suspicion that shadows many men of fighting age. They walk into markets and train stations, visit farms and bakeries, and carry the small burdens of ordinary existence. Beneath that familiar rhythm, messages begin to move. Routes form. Meeting places appear. Paths through forests become known to those who must travel them quietly. You watch the woman wheel her bicycle past the church and toward the narrow lane where her house stands. She pauses at the gate for a moment, glancing toward the road as though measuring the distance she has just traveled. The journey has been short in miles, yet its meaning extends far beyond the village. Because somewhere beyond these fields, the hidden network will continue its work. Messages will pass again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. Over time, the quiet gestures of people like her will connect villages across valleys and mountains, weaving the countryside into something stronger than the occupation authorities realize. The forests will shelter those who choose to live beyond the reach of German patrols. The roads will carry instructions from one hidden group to another, and the women who move between these places will become the steady pulse of communication that allows resistance to survive. For now, however, the village returns to its stillness. A cart rolls slowly along the road. The wind lifts dust from the fields, and somewhere beneath the calm surface of everyday life, the first quiet threads of the Maquis are beginning to take hold. The quiet shape of occupation. The occupation does not arrive all at once in places like this. It settles gradually, like a fog moving through low ground, filling spaces that once belonged entirely to the routines of village life. At first, the changes seem small enough to overlook. A new sign appears at the railway station. Soldiers pass through the square where market stalls once crowded together on summer mornings. The villagers notice these things, of course, but the habits of daily survival encourage them to keep moving, to continue their work as though the land itself has not shifted beneath their feet. You watch the slow adjustment unfold through gestures that repeat themselves day after day. Farmers lead horses through the fields under a sky that feels slightly lower than before. Shopkeepers measure flour behind wooden counters while glancing occasionally toward the road where military trucks sometimes pass. The rhythm of life continues, though it carries a quiet tension that settles into the background like the distant hum of an engine that never quite disappears. In the early months, most people believe the occupation will pass as other hardships have passed. France has known war before. Villages have learned how to bend without breaking. Yet as the weeks stretch into seasons, the presence of foreign authority becomes more organized, more deliberate. Notices appear on walls written in formal language that leaves little room for misunderstanding. Curfews are announced. Rationing expands. The railway timetable begins to change. You notice the way people gather in small clusters to read the posted announcements. Their voices remain low, though the streets around them remain empty. No one wishes to appear defiant. Not yet. The safest response is quiet observation. Watch carefully. Speak cautiously. Remember what has changed. For women moving through these spaces, daily life remains outwardly familiar. They carry baskets to the market, visit neighbors, stand in queues for bread and cooking oil. The same gestures continue as they always have. Yet beneath those gestures, attention sharpens. The presence of soldiers alters the meaning of simple actions. A glance that once carried no significance now becomes a way of measuring distance, timing, and safety. You watch a young woman step from a narrow doorway onto the street just after midday. She adjusts the scarf around her hair and begins walking toward the square, a small basket balanced against her hip. Her pace is unhurried. The sound of her shoes against the stones blends easily with the quiet murmur of the village. At the corner, she pauses to allow a truck to pass. German soldiers sit in the back beneath a canvas cover, their rifles resting against their shoulders as the vehicle rolls slowly through the village. No one speaks as it passes. The people standing nearby simply step aside, their faces calm, their eyes lowered or turned politely away. When the truck disappears beyond the church, conversation resumes with the same soft rhythm it carried before. You begin to notice how quickly ordinary life absorbs the presence of war. This absorption is not acceptance. It is survival. Villages across occupied France learn the same lesson within weeks of the armistice. Resistance, if it is to exist at all, must first learn to hide within the patterns of daily routine. Any gesture that stands apart too sharply will draw attention, and attention, under occupation, can travel quickly through the wrong channels. Women often stand at the center of these routines. They move through the village at every hour of the day, crossing paths with neighbors, shopkeepers, railway clerks, and soldiers who have begun to treat the streets as their own. Their presence attracts little suspicion. A woman carrying bread or cloth or vegetables is simply another part of the landscape. Yet observation begins quietly behind these movements. You watch the young woman in the scarf enter the small grocery shop beside the square. The doorbell rings once as she steps inside. Shelves along the walls hold jars of preserved fruit and tins of oil that grow fewer each month as rationing tightens. The shopkeeper greets her with a nod that carries the weight of familiarity rather than conversation. She selects a small packet of salt and places it on the counter. As the shopkeeper wraps the purchase in brown paper, the woman glances toward the window where the road remains visible through a narrow gap between buildings. A patrol of soldiers appears at the far end of the square, walking in pairs beneath the pale afternoon light. Their boots strike the stones with a rhythm that feels foreign to the village, too measured, too deliberate. The woman's gaze lingers for a moment before returning to the counter. Nothing in her expression reveals what she has noticed. Outside, the soldiers cross the square and disappear along the road that leads toward the railway station. The village absorbs their passage the way it absorbs every other intrusion now, quietly, without protest, allowing the surface of daily life to settle again once they are gone. This quiet observation repeats itself across the countryside. Women waiting in bread lines remember which soldiers patrol which streets. Women standing on railway platforms notice the numbers painted on freight cars and the destinations written beside them. Women visiting neighboring farms pay attention to the direction of trucks that move along rural roads where traffic once consisted only of carts and bicycles. At first, these fragments of information remain scattered. No one knows yet how they might be used. The war still feels distant from the rhythms of village life. It exists somewhere beyond the horizon where armies maneuver and governments speak through radio broadcasts that fade in and out with the shifting weather. But as weeks pass, people begin to understand that the occupation itself has become a kind of battlefield. Not one fought with rifles, but one shaped by memory. You watch the young woman leave the grocery shop with her parcel tucked neatly into the basket. The square has grown quieter now. The afternoon sun stretches long shadows across the stones, and the church bell marks the slow passage of time with a sound that carries across the rooftops. She walks toward the edge of the village where the road bends beside a row of poplar trees. As she passes a narrow alleyway, another woman steps out from the shade. Their meeting appears accidental. One slows slightly while adjusting the handle of her basket. The other pauses as though deciding which direction to take next. For a moment they stand close enough to exchange a glance. No words pass between them. Then they continue walking in opposite directions. To anyone watching, the moment would seem ordinary. Yet something within the stillness of that brief encounter suggests the first quiet movement of a network beginning to form, one built not on speeches or banners, but on small recognitions carried through ordinary spaces. The occupation has reshaped the landscape of daily life. And within that landscape, people have begun to watch one another more carefully than before. Not with suspicion, but with the cautious awareness that somewhere among these familiar streets, others may be noticing the same things they are. The village remains calm as evening approaches. Smoke rises from chimneys. The scent of cooking drifts through open windows while bicycles roll slowly along the roads that lead toward distant farms. Nothing about the scene suggests the presence of conflict. And yet beneath the quiet surface of this ordinary day, the first foundations of resistance are settling into place. Not through sudden defiance, but through patience. Through observation repeated again and again until the act of watching itself begins to change the way people move through their world. You stand quietly within that moment, listening to the village breathe beneath the long shadow of occupation. Evening settles over the village with the slow patience of habit. Light fades gradually along the stone walls, and the warmth of the day lingers in the dust of the road long after the sun has dropped behind the distant hills. Windows glow one by one as lamps are lit inside narrow rooms where families gather around small tables. The war rarely intrudes loudly into these hours. It remains present in the background, felt more than seen, like a pressure that rests quietly against the edges of ordinary life. You watch the village move into its evening rhythm. Pots simmer on small stoves. A radio crackles softly in a corner where someone adjusts the dial in search of a signal that travels through layers of interference. Outside, bicycles lean against doorways while their owners step indoors for supper. The air grows cooler as the last light fades from the rooftops. Curfew approaches. This is one of the changes that has slowly reshaped the village since the occupation began. At first, the rule seemed temporary, another administrative measure announced in the formal language of posted notices. But over time, it has become part of the landscape, as familiar as the church bell that marks the passing hours. When darkness deepens, the streets empty. Doors close. Lamps are dimmed behind curtains drawn carefully across the windows. You notice how people prepare for the quiet of these hours with a kind of practiced calm. They finish their errands early. Conversations that might once have lingered in the square now move indoors where voices can soften behind walls. The village does not sleep exactly, but it becomes still in a way that feels deliberate. For those who have begun to watch more closely, the stillness carries opportunity as well as caution. In one small house near the edge of the village, a young woman sits beside a wooden table where the light of a single lamp falls across a folded piece of cloth. Her hands move slowly through the fabric as she mends a seam that has begun to fray along the edge. The work requires little attention. Her thoughts drift elsewhere while the needle passes in and out of the thread. Across the room, a man listens to the radio with his head tilted slightly toward the speaker. The signal fades in and out, interrupted by bursts of static that swallow whole sentences before releasing them again in fragments. He adjusts the dial gently, searching for clarity among the shifting frequencies. Somewhere far away a voice speaks in measured tones about troop movements and political declarations that feel distant from the quiet interior of this room. The war described through the radio exists on another scale entirely. Armies crossing borders, governments negotiating alliances, cities burning beneath the weight of bombardment. Here, the war arrives differently. Through ration cards placed carefully inside kitchen drawers. Through soldiers passing along the road outside. Through curfews that shorten the hours of evening conversation. The young woman finishes the seam and sets the cloth aside. She rises from the table and walks to the window where the curtain hangs loosely against the glass. With 2 fingers she lifts the edge just enough to look toward the street. The road lies empty beneath the dim light of a single lantern fixed beside the church wall. Shadows stretch across the stones where bicycles passed earlier in the day. Nothing moves now except the faint sway of tree branches stirred by the evening wind. You watch her hold the curtain for a moment longer than necessary. Observation has begun to replace habit. In the early weeks of occupation, people often avoided looking directly at the changes unfolding around them. Attention carried a certain danger. To notice too much was to invite questions about what one intended to do with that knowledge. But slowly, quietly, the opposite instinct has begun to grow. Watching becomes a form of preparation. The woman lets the curtain fall back into place and returns to the table where a small notebook rests beside the lamp. She opens it carefully, turning past pages filled with ordinary lists, bread, flour, soap, until she reaches a blank space near the back. The pencil moves slowly across the paper. 2 trucks pass the square at midday. 4 soldiers walking patrol near the railway road. The words are simple. They resemble the notes someone might keep about weather or harvest schedules. When she finishes writing, she closes the notebook and places it beneath the folded cloth she was mending earlier. The information may never be used, yet she writes it down anyway. Across occupied France, similar acts of quiet record-keeping begin to appear in kitchens and bedrooms, in farmhouses and village shops. People who once concerned themselves only with the rhythm of harvests and market days now find their attention drawn toward the movement of soldiers, the timing of patrols, the sounds of vehicles passing along distant roads. At first, these observations belong only to the individuals who notice them, but over time they begin to travel. You see how this movement occurs through ordinary conversation that carries meanings just beneath the surface of daily speech. A woman visiting her neighbor might mention that the road near the railway station seemed unusually busy that afternoon. Another might remark that soldiers have begun arriving earlier in the evening than before. The remarks appear casual, almost incidental, yet each one adds another small piece to a larger understanding that is beginning to take shape. The young woman at the table extinguishes the lamp when the church bell marks the hour of curfew. Darkness settles quickly across the room, leaving only the faint glow of moonlight slipping through the curtain. Outside, the village rests in the quiet stillness required by occupation. You listen to the night gather around the houses. In the distance a vehicle moves along the road, its engine echoing briefly across the fields before fading into silence again. Somewhere a dog barks once, then stops as though reminded of the hour. The wind passes through the poplar trees with a soft rustling sound that blends with the steady rhythm of breathing from the sleeping village. The war continues beyond the horizon. But here, within the quiet boundaries of this place, something else continues as well. Observation deepens. People begin to notice patterns that once slipped easily past their attention. The regularity of patrol routes, the timing of train departures, the number of soldiers stationed near certain crossroads. Each detail settles into memory, where it remains waiting for the moment when it might become useful. Women often carry these observations farther than others. Their daily responsibilities move them naturally through the spaces where such details appear. They stand in queues beside railway platforms where freight cars wait beneath the watch of guards. They visit farms where conversations travel across fields more easily than through crowded streets. They cross village squares where soldiers pause to smoke cigarettes beneath the shade of trees planted long before the war began. Each movement gathers fragments of knowledge. For now, those fragments remain scattered. The village sleeps beneath the watch of curfew lanterns while the countryside stretches outward into darkness. Forests rise along the hills beyond the fields, their shadows thick enough to conceal entire paths from those who do not know where to look. Soon, people will begin to follow those paths more often. Messages will move between villages. Travel will carry quiet purpose. But tonight the foundations remain simple. A notebook beneath a folded cloth. A memory of trucks passing through the square. A glance exchanged in the shade of an alleyway. You stand within the stillness of the occupied village and feel the quiet shape of resistance beginning to form, not through sudden action, but through patience that grows stronger with each day of careful watching. The occupation has altered the rhythm of life, and in response, the people who live here have begun to alter the rhythm of their attention. The memory of roads. Morning returns to the countryside long before the village is fully awake. A pale light spreads slowly across the fields, touching the edges of fences and stone walls that have marked the boundaries of farmland for generations. The air carries the cool scent of earth and damp grass, and the roads remain empty except for the occasional bicycle moving quietly between distant farms. You watch the countryside stretch outward beyond the cluster of rooftops where the village rests. Roads wind across the hills in long, patient curves, linking one settlement to another in patterns shaped by centuries of travel. Some roads follow the old Roman lines that once crossed Gaul with deliberate precision. Others wander gently between hedgerows where the path formed naturally over time, guided by the movement of carts and livestock rather than careful planning. These roads have always carried the quiet traffic of rural life. Farmers moving produce toward market. Families visiting neighboring villages on Sundays. Children riding bicycles toward school in the early hours of the day. The occupation has not erased these movements. Instead, it has layered something new upon them. German patrols appear along the same routes once used only by villagers. Trucks travel the roads at unfamiliar hours. Occasionally, a convoy of vehicles moves through the countryside with the purposeful rhythm of military logistics. Yet the roads remain open, and that openness creates possibilities that the occupation authorities have not fully understood. You watch a young woman step out from a farmhouse at the edge of the fields. She adjusts the strap of a small satchel resting across her shoulder and lifts a bicycle from beside the wooden gate. The morning is quiet enough that the sound of the tires pressing against the dirt road seems unusually clear. Her destination lies several kilometers away in another village where a weekly market draws people from across the surrounding countryside. The trip would appear ordinary to anyone who might notice her passing along the road. A woman traveling toward market is simply part of the rhythm of rural life. Yet beneath that ordinary purpose rests another. The satchel she carries holds no vegetables or bread. Instead, it contains a folded sheet of paper tucked carefully between the lining of two cloth panels. The message inside is brief. Only a few lines written in careful script. Instructions that will pass from one pair of hands to another before the day is finished. You notice how calmly she begins the journey. Her pace remains steady, neither hurried nor hesitant. The war has taught those who travel these roads that calm movement attracts the least attention. Speed suggests urgency. Hesitation invites curiosity. A steady rhythm, however, blends easily into the quiet background of countryside traffic. The bicycle follows the road as it curves between fields of wheat that sway gently beneath the morning wind. Birds rise from the hedgerows as she passes, their wings scattering briefly across the sky before settling again among the branches. The landscape carries the peaceful appearance of a place untouched by conflict. But appearances have begun to mislead. A kilometer beyond the farmhouse, the road meets a narrow bridge where a shallow stream crosses beneath the stones. Wooden posts stand on either side, marking the entrance to the crossing. Today, a German soldier leans casually against one of the posts, his rifle resting beside him while he watches the road. The young woman sees him long before she reaches the bridge. You notice the way her posture changes only slightly. Her shoulders remain relaxed. Her pace continues without interruption. The The bicycle rolls forward with the same quiet rhythm it carried moments earlier. This is the skill that women traveling these roads have begun to learn. Control of appearance. As she approaches the bridge, the soldier straightens and glances toward the satchel hanging from her shoulder. His expression carries mild curiosity rather than suspicion. Travelers pass this way often. Farmers, merchants, villagers moving between towns. Most carry goods that have become scarce under rationing. He raises a hand. The bicycle slows. "Where are you going?" he asks in careful French. The woman answers calmly, explaining that she is traveling to the market in the neighboring village. Her voice carries the steady tone of someone accustomed to ordinary conversation rather than confrontation. She gestures toward the satchel as though it contains purchases she hopes to trade later in the morning. The soldier studies her for a moment. Behind him, the stream moves quietly beneath the bridge, its surface catching the pale light of early morning. A breeze passes through the trees along the roadside, stirring the leaves with a sound that softens the tension of the moment. Finally, the soldier nods. He steps aside and waves her forward. The bicycle crosses the bridge and continues along the road without pause. You watch the landscape absorb the moment as though nothing unusual has occurred. The soldier returns to his post beside the wooden marker. The stream continues its quiet passage beneath the stones, and the woman riding the bicycle moves steadily toward the distant village where the market stalls will soon begin to fill with people. This quiet passage repeats itself across the countryside in countless variations. Women travel roads that thread through fields and forests, carrying messages hidden within baskets, satchels, and the folds of clothing that appear entirely ordinary to those who see them pass. Their journeys follow routes shaped by familiarity rather than secrecy. Roads that villagers have used for generations become the arteries of communication for something new. At first, these journeys remain isolated. A message delivered here, a meeting arranged there. But over time, the roads themselves begin to form a network. You watch how knowledge of distance becomes part of this system. The number of minutes required to reach a crossroads. The safest hour to pass through a village square where soldiers sometimes gather near the cafe. The places along the road where trees grow thick enough to conceal a brief pause if a patrol approaches unexpectedly. Each journey adds another layer of understanding. Women who travel these roads begin to carry maps in memory rather than on paper. They remember the turns and landmarks that guide them through the countryside without attracting attention. A weathered barn beside a field of rye. A cluster of poplar trees where the road divides. A small chapel standing alone near the edge of a forest. These markers form a language of navigation known only to those who move through the countryside often enough to recognize their quiet significance. The woman riding toward the market has already memorized much of this landscape. She knows which farms lie along the route and which families can be trusted if assistance becomes necessary. She knows the schedule of the train that passes through the nearby station each afternoon. She knows how long it takes to ride from one village to another if the road remains clear. The bicycle becomes more than transportation. It becomes timing. Movement measured in distance and memory. You follow her journey as the road bends gently around a hillside where the fields begin to rise toward the forest beyond. The market village appears gradually between the trees, its church tower visible above the rooftops as the sun climbs higher into the morning sky. Soon the square will fill with voices. Farmers arranging produce. Women exchanging news beside market stalls. Children weaving through the crowd with small coins clutched in their hands. Within that movement, messages will pass quietly from one person to another. For now, however, the road remains calm beneath the turning wheels of the bicycle. and the countryside continues to carry its quiet traffic beneath a sky that reveals nothing of the hidden journeys unfolding along its winding paths. By the time the road reaches the neighboring village, the morning has fully awakened. Market day changes the atmosphere of a place long before the first stalls are arranged in the square. Carts begin arriving from distant farms, their wheels pressing shallow tracks into the dust of the road. Bicycles lean against fences while their riders unload baskets filled with eggs, vegetables, and cloth bundles that hold whatever the household has managed to spare. You watch the young woman slow her bicycle as the first houses appear beside the road. The village greets the morning with the quiet energy of routine commerce. A man lifts crates from the back of a cart near the well. Two elderly women arrange folded linen across a wooden table where they will trade cloth for cooking oil or flour. The church bell rings once, its sound drifting across the square as people gather beneath the pale warmth of the rising sun. Nothing about the scene suggests the presence of resistance. This is precisely why places like this have become useful. Markets gather people who would otherwise remain separated by distance. Farmers travel from hillsides several kilometers away. Shopkeepers from neighboring towns arrive with small inventories to exchange. Women from scattered farms meet acquaintances they may see only once each week. Conversation flows easily in these spaces because the market has always served as a place where news travels alongside goods. Under occupation, that habit of shared information begins to carry a quieter purpose. The young woman guides her bicycle toward the edge of the square, where a line of wooden posts stands beside the road. She leans the frame against one of them and adjusts the strap of the satchel across her shoulder. The movement appears natural among the bustle of the market. People arrive and depart constantly. No one pays particular attention to a single bicycle joining the dozens already gathered along the roadside. You watch her step into the crowd. Voices overlap in a gentle murmur as buyers and sellers exchange greetings. The language of the market remains ordinary. Questions about harvest yields, remarks about the weather, quiet complaints about rationing. These conversations create a soft cover of sound that allows other, smaller exchanges to pass unnoticed. Near the well at the center of the square, a woman stands beside a stall where jars of preserved fruit are arranged in neat rows. She greets customers with a calm smile while her hands move steadily between coins and packages. Her presence appears as routine as the stall itself. Yet her attention occasionally drifts beyond the jars toward the flow of people crossing the square. When the young woman approaches, their meeting appears entirely coincidental. She pauses beside the stall, examining the jars as though considering which one to purchase. The stall owner continues speaking with another customer, her voice warm and patient. A moment later she wraps a jar in brown paper and hands it across the counter. The young woman waits. Then, without speaking, she sets her satchel briefly upon the edge of the table while reaching for a coin inside her coat pocket. The stall owner lifts the satchel slightly to move it aside. Her hand lingers just long enough for the folded paper hidden within the lining to pass from one space to another. The exchange lasts less than a breath. No one nearby notices. When the young woman lifts the satchel again, the message is no longer there. In its place remains only the ordinary weight of cloth and empty space. She selects a small jar of fruit, thanks the stall owner, and continues walking through the market with the relaxed pace of someone whose errands are nearly finished. You begin to understand how easily messages move within environments like this. Crowds create a rhythm that conceals individual gestures. Hands pass objects naturally while exchanging goods. Baskets and satchels change positions constantly as people shift their belongings during conversation. Each motion blends into the larger choreography of the marketplace. What appears to be commerce becomes communication. Across occupied France, Markets serve this quiet function week after week. Women traveling from distant villages carry information gathered through careful observation, patrol routes, troop movements, rumors overheard at railway stations. These fragments travel through stalls and alleyways where goods change hands beneath the open sky. The stall owner waits until the young woman disappears into the crowd before stepping away from her table. She leaves another woman to watch the jars while she walks toward a narrow street that leads away from the square. The folded paper rests inside her apron pocket now, hidden among the cloth folds where it cannot easily be seen. You follow her through the quiet street where the noise of the market fades behind the walls of stone houses. She enters a small courtyard where a wooden cart stands beside a stack of empty crates. A man works there repairing the wheel of a wagon, his tools scattered across the ground beside him. When she approaches, he wipes his hands on a rag and nods in greeting. No words are exchanged. She removes the folded paper and places it on the crate nearest him. The man lifts it slowly, reading the lines with the calm focus of someone accustomed to receiving instructions through indirect means. When he finishes, the paper disappears into the pocket of his work coat. Moments later, the woman returns to the square, where the market continues without interruption. You notice how smoothly these movements integrate with the natural rhythm of village life. The people involved rarely linger long enough to attract attention. Each exchange becomes part of a chain that extends beyond any single location. Information moves step by step across the countryside, carried by individuals who appear to be engaged in nothing more than the ordinary tasks of rural existence. The young woman retrieves her bicycle shortly before midday. The square has grown more crowded as the market reaches its busiest hour. Farmers haggle gently over the price of vegetables, while children weave through the stalls with wide curiosity. The sound of laughter drifts through the warm air, mingling with the rustle of cloth and the occasional clatter of wooden crates being shifted across the ground. She mounts the bicycle and turns toward the road that leads back through the fields. From the outside, her journey appears complete. She has visited the market, made a small purchase, and begun the return trip toward home. Nothing about the movement would suggest that she has participated in a quiet network of communication stretching across several villages. Yet the message she carried has already begun traveling farther. The man in the courtyard will pass the information along to another courier later that afternoon. From there, it may reach a forest encampment where men and women have begun to gather beyond the immediate reach of occupation patrols. The details contained within those few written lines, perhaps the schedule of a train or the presence of additional soldiers near a crossroads, will become part of a larger understanding forming slowly within the countryside. You watch the bicycle move away from the village as the road curves back toward the open fields. The countryside appears unchanged beneath the midday sun. Wheat ripples gently across the hills. A farmer guides his horse along the edge of a field where the soil has been turned for planting. In the distance, the same narrow bridge waits where the soldiers stood earlier that morning. The road remembers every traveler who passes along its surface. Wheels press their marks into the dust. Footsteps leave brief impressions beside the hedgerows. Over time, these signs fade beneath wind and weather, yet the memory of movement remains carried by those who travel the path often enough to know its quiet language. Women riding these roads begin to carry that memory within themselves. They remember the safe hours to travel, the villages where trust has grown strong, the places where caution must deepen. Each journey becomes another thread woven into the hidden network forming across rural France. For now, the roads continue to appear peaceful. But beneath the calm rhythm of bicycles moving between villages, something larger has begun to take shape, something patient enough to grow slowly, carried forward by people who move through the countryside with the steady confidence of those who know that the simplest paths can sometimes lead to the quietest forms of resistance. Waiting beneath the trees. Beyond the last cultivated fields, the land begins to rise toward the forests that stretch across the hills of central France. From a distance, the trees appear as a dark band along the horizon, their crowns merging into a single line that moves gently with the wind. Farmers have always known these woods as places of work and shelter. Firewood is gathered here in winter. Chestnuts fall along the forest floor in autumn. Narrow paths cross the slopes where villagers have walked for generations between distant farms. Under occupation, the forests begin to acquire another meaning. You watch the countryside change as the road leading from the village narrows and bends toward the tree line. The open fields slowly give way to rough pasture and scattered hedgerows. Stone walls appear more frequently here, marking boundaries that once separated grazing land from cultivated ground. The farther the road climbs, the fewer houses remain visible across the hills. This distance matters. The war unfolding across Europe is loud in cities and along the front lines, but in places like this its presence travels quietly, carried by rumors and by the slow accumulation of small decisions made by individuals who have begun to look toward the forests with new attention. At first, the movement is cautious. Men who fear arrest slip away from their villages after dark and spend nights beneath the trees before returning home at dawn. Others begin storing small supplies in abandoned sheds or hollow spaces beneath fallen trunks. These actions remain isolated in the early months of occupation. No clear structure binds them together yet. But the forest holds a kind of patience. You stand at the edge of the trees where the path disappears beneath the shade of oak and chestnut branches. The air feels cooler here, damp with the scent of moss and leaf litter. Sunlight filters through the canopy in thin columns that drift slowly across the ground as the wind moves through the leaves above. A woman steps onto the path with a basket balanced against her arm. From the outside, she might appear to be gathering wood or searching for mushrooms along the forest floor. The basket carries enough weight to support that impression. A small knife rests at her belt beside the folded cloth used for collecting whatever the forest might offer. Yet her movements follow a rhythm that suggests another purpose. She walks deeper among the trees with steady familiarity, turning along paths that are nearly invisible unless one knows where to look. The ground slopes gently upward as the forest thickens around her. Birdsong echoes softly through the branches, accompanied by the occasional crack of twigs beneath her steps. You begin to notice how sound behaves differently here. Voices travel only short distances before dissolving among the leaves. Footsteps vanish quickly beneath the soft ground. The forest absorbs movement rather than announcing it. This quality has begun to draw attention from those who must move carefully through occupied territory. After nearly 20 minutes, the woman reaches a small clearing where the trees pull back just enough to reveal a circle of open ground. The space might once have served as a resting place for woodcutters. A rough stump stands near the center where someone has used it recently to split branches into smaller lengths. She sets the basket beside the stump and waits. Waiting becomes a familiar condition for those who enter the forests during these years. Time moves differently beneath the trees. Without the rhythm of church bells or village noise to measure the passing hours, people rely on smaller signals: the angle of sunlight between branches, the shift of shadows along the forest floor, the changing chorus of birds as the morning grows older. You watch her stand quietly in the clearing. Minutes pass. Then more. The forest holds its calm around her, interrupted only by the rustling of leaves stirred by the wind. A squirrel crosses the edge of the clearing before vanishing again among the branches. Somewhere deeper within the woods, a woodpecker taps steadily against the trunk of a tree. She remains still. This patience is not accidental. It has been learned slowly through repetition. Those who begin meeting in the forest understand that arriving early and waiting quietly reduces the risk of attracting attention. The countryside may appear empty, but it is never entirely free of wandering eyes. Eventually, another figure emerges along the path. A man steps into the clearing carrying a bundle of sticks tied loosely with rope. He pauses near the edge of the open space, scanning the trees before continuing forward. His movements are cautious but not fearful. Like the woman, he has grown accustomed to the slow rhythm of these meetings. They greet one another with a brief nod. No conversation begins immediately. Instead, the man lowers his bundle beside the stump and begins separating the sticks as though preparing them for firewood. The woman lifts her basket and removes a small cloth-wrapped parcel from beneath the gathered branches. She places it on the stump where the man can reach it easily while continuing his work. From a distance, the scene resembles two villagers sharing a moment of labor in the forest. Yet the parcel contains folded papers collected during several recent journeys between villages. Observations about patrol routes. Notes regarding train schedules near the railway line. Names of farms where food might be obtained quietly if supplies become scarce. The information is not dramatic, but it is useful. You begin to understand how the forest gradually becomes more than a meeting place. It becomes a reservoir where fragments of knowledge gather until they can be carried onward to others who need them. The man opens the parcel carefully, scanning the pages with a focused expression that betrays none of the quiet significance of what he reads. When he finishes, he folds the papers again and tucks them inside the lining of his coat. For a moment, the two stand beside the stump, listening to the forest breathe around them. No formal instructions are exchanged. Instead, the woman gestures toward the path that leads deeper among the trees. The man follows her gaze toward the darker part of the woods, where the ground rises toward a ridge hidden from view by thick branches. More people have begun moving into those deeper areas in recent weeks. Men avoiding forced labor orders issued by the occupation authorities. Others who have chosen to disappear from villages where suspicion has begun to grow. They gather in small groups beneath the trees, building temporary shelters from branches and canvas salvaged from abandoned farms. These early encampments remain fragile. Food must be carried in secret from nearby villages. Information travels slowly through uncertain channels, and the constant threat of discovery lingers like a shadow along the forest paths. Yet the woods provide something the villages cannot: distance. You follow the woman as she lifts her basket again and turns toward the darker trail leading deeper into the forest. The man gathers his bundle of sticks and falls into step behind her. Their footsteps disappear quickly into the soft earth as the clearing fades behind them. The forest grows denser along the ridge. Branches interlock overhead, dimming the sunlight until the air takes on a greenish hue filtered through layers of leaves. The path narrows to little more than a faint depression between roots and moss-covered stones. You notice how carefully they move along this terrain, each step placed deliberately, each turn chosen with the quiet certainty of those who have begun memorizing the forest as others memorize the streets of a town. Somewhere ahead, beyond the curve of the ridge, other figures wait among the trees. And slowly, patiently, the forest begins to shelter something new. The forest deepens as the path climbs toward the ridge. Sunlight thins beneath the canopy, turning the air cool and muted. The ground here has not been disturbed by farm tools or cartwheels for many years. Moss gathers across fallen branches, and the scent of damp earth lingers beneath the shade of chestnut and oak. You watch the two figures move slowly through this quiet terrain. Their footsteps make little sound. The forest floor receives each step gently, absorbing the small disturbances that might carry across open ground in the fields below. In places, the path becomes difficult to follow unless one has traveled it before. A curve around a large root. A narrow passage between stones hidden beneath leaves. These details begin to matter. The woman pauses occasionally to glance behind her, not with fear, but with the calm awareness that the forest must always be entered and left with care. In the villages, observation takes place among crowds and familiar streets. Here the rules shift slightly. The forest demands patience, and those who walk beneath its branches learn to move slowly enough that the land itself becomes a quiet ally. After several minutes, the path widens into another clearing. This one is larger than the first, though it remains hidden from view unless a traveler steps directly into the space. A fallen tree lies across one side of the clearing where its trunk has begun to soften beneath years of rain and moss. Near the center stands a small arrangement of stones that might once have held a cooking fire. Two men sit nearby, their coats draped loosely across their shoulders as they rest against the base of a tree. They look up when the woman and the man carrying the sticks emerge from the path. Recognition appears quickly, followed by the quiet ease of familiarity that has begun to grow among those who gather here. No one raises their voice. In places like this, conversation rarely needs to carry far. You notice the way the clearing holds them together in a circle of quiet activity. One of the men lifts a small pot from beside the stones where a few embers glow faintly beneath the ashes. Another unrolls a piece of cloth that holds several slices of dark bread. The woman sets her basket down near the fallen trunk and begins sorting through its contents with steady hands. These movements form the early shape of life inside the forest. Nothing about the scene resembles the dramatic images that often accompany stories of resistance. There are no uniforms, no banners, only a handful of people sharing food beneath the trees while exchanging the small pieces of information that will help them remain unseen. You watch the man who carried the bundle of sticks remove the folded papers from his coat. He passes them carefully across the clearing to another figure who has just arrived along the path. This new arrival carries a satchel similar to the one used earlier by the woman traveling to the market. The network continues to extend itself. Each person who steps into the clearing brings another connection to the villages beyond the forest. Messages move from hand to hand, carried onward by those who must return to ordinary life before nightfall. For now, however, the clearing serves as a place of waiting. Waiting becomes the dominant rhythm of these early forest gatherings. Some have come here to avoid arrest. Others wait for instructions that have not yet arrived. Food must be gathered slowly. Supplies must be hidden carefully beneath branches or buried beneath loose soil where they will remain unseen if patrols search the area. The forest encourages this kind of patience. You notice how time passes differently in the clearing than it does in the village square. Without the sound of church bells or market chatter, the hours unfold through smaller signals. The angle of sunlight drifting across the moss. The change in temperature as afternoon approaches. The gradual quieting of birds that retreat deeper into the woods when shadows lengthen beneath the trees. The woman sits beside the fallen trunk and listens while the others speak quietly about the roads leading through the surrounding hills. Someone mentions a patrol that has begun appearing near a bridge farther south. Another describes a truck convoy seen passing through a neighboring village 2 days earlier. Each observation adds another fragment to the understanding they share. You begin to see how knowledge gathers slowly in places like this. No single person carries the entire picture. Instead, the information spreads across many individuals, each one holding a small piece of the larger pattern forming across the countryside. Women often move between these fragments more freely than the men who remain hidden within the forest. Their presence in the villages allows them to travel openly along roads where others might attract suspicion. They listen in markets. They observe patrol movements from the windows of grocery shops and bakeries. When they return to the forest, they bring these quiet observations with them, placing them into the shared pool of memory that sustains the growing network. The clearing grows quieter as afternoon light begins to soften. Some of the men rise to stretch their legs or gather additional branches for the fire. Others sit in thoughtful silence, their attention drifting toward the distant sounds of the countryside beyond the ridge. You watch the woman stand and lift her basket again. Soon she will return to the village before the evening curfew settles across the roads. Her path back through the forest will follow the same careful route that brought her here earlier in the day. When she reaches the fields again, the war will fade once more into the background of ordinary life. She will appear simply as another villager returning home with a basket gathered from the woods. Yet the time spent in the clearing will travel with her. The conversations, the observations, the quiet understanding of how the forest is beginning to shelter people who have chosen not to submit quietly to the occupation. You follow her as she steps once more onto the narrow path leading away from the clearing. Behind her, the small group settles back into the patient rhythm of waiting beneath the trees. Smoke rises faintly from the embers near the stones, drifting upward through the branches where it dissolves into the afternoon air. The forest returns to its calm breathing, concealing the presence of those who remain within its quiet boundaries. This pattern will repeat itself many times in the months ahead. Journeys from village to forest. Messages passed quietly between hands. Hours spent waiting beneath trees while the network of resistance slowly gathers strength. The forest does not rush. It grows accustomed to the footsteps of those who move carefully along its hidden paths. And in that quiet patience, something new begins to take root among the hills of occupied France, something that depends not on sudden action, but on endurance carried quietly through the long days of waiting. The weight of small journeys. By late summer, the roads begin to carry more bicycles than before. At first, the increase is subtle. A traveler here, another passing in the opposite direction a few minutes later. To anyone watching from the doorway of a village cafe, the movement might appear like the ordinary pulse of countryside life continuing as it always has. But if you remain still long enough beside one of these roads, you begin to notice a different pattern emerging. Journeys are becoming more frequent. The countryside between villages is rarely empty now. Women travel along the narrow lanes with baskets tied to their handlebars or satchels resting against their hips. Some ride toward markets, others toward farms where relatives live beyond the reach of town gossip. Their reasons appear simple, even mundane, yet the roads remember every journey. Dust rises beneath the turning wheels. Gravel shifts softly beneath narrow tires. The paths connecting villages begin to carry the quiet rhythm of repeated travel, and with repetition comes familiarity. You watch the countryside unfold beneath the pale light of morning. Fields stretch across the hills in gentle curves, their colors shifting from deep green to the dusty gold of late summer grain. The roads thread between hedgerows where birds scatter at the sound of approaching wheels. Occasionally a cart creaks along the same path, pulled slowly by a horse whose steady pace has guided these routes for generations. Among this movement rides a woman whose face remains calm beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. Her bicycle follows the curve of the road that leads toward a distant village resting along the edge of a wooded ridge. A small bundle of cloth rests inside the basket tied to the handlebars. To anyone who might glance in her direction, the bundle would appear to contain bread or vegetables gathered from the morning market. In reality, the cloth hides several folded sheets of paper. You notice how carefully the papers have been arranged inside the bundle. They lie between layers of linen so thin that even a curious search might fail to notice them unless the cloth were unfolded entirely. The woman who rides this road has learned these small techniques from others who travel similar paths. No written instructions exist for such things. The knowledge spreads quietly through observation and experience. One courier shows another how to fold a message so that the edges lie flat against the grain of fabric. Another demonstrates how to conceal small objects inside the seams of clothing without leaving visible marks. These lessons pass from hand to hand the way farmers once passed knowledge about soil and weather. You watch the woman approach a bend where the road narrows between two stone walls. Moss grows thick along the shaded side of the stones, and vines hang down from the top where years of wind have carried seeds into small pockets of soil. The bend conceals the road ahead. Moments like this have begun to carry quiet tension for those who travel frequently between villages. A patrol might appear suddenly from the opposite direction. A truck could round the curve with little warning. Those who ride these roads learn to listen as carefully as they watch. She slows slightly as the bicycle rolls toward the bend. The air remains calm. No engines echo across the hills. Only the distant hum of insects drifting above the fields and the soft rasp of tires against gravel. When the road opens again beyond the wall, the path ahead appears empty. She continues riding. You notice how her posture remains relaxed even as her attention moves quietly through the landscape. The road becomes something she reads as she travels. Each curve, each distant farm, each cluster of trees carries information that helps her judge the safety of the journey. These small journeys form the quiet backbone of the resistance beginning to grow across the countryside. Men who remain hidden inside the forests cannot move openly through the villages without attracting attention. The women who travel these roads become the connection between those hidden spaces and the ordinary world that continues beyond the trees. Messages pass along these routes, but so do supplies. You watch as the woman reaches a small farm standing alone beside the road. The farmhouse rests beneath a sloping roof of dark tiles, its walls weathered by decades of wind and rain. A garden stretches beside the house where rows of beans and cabbage grow in neat lines across the soil. She slows the bicycle and turns through the open gate. A farmer stands near the garden fence, wiping dirt from his hands with a cloth as he watches her approach. Their greeting is quiet, almost casual. To anyone observing from a distance, the visit would appear no different from the many exchanges that take place between neighbors scattered across the countryside. The woman removes the cloth bundle from her basket and places it carefully on the wooden table beside the garden. The farmer lifts it slowly. For a moment, his fingers rest on the linen as though he is simply weighing its contents. Then he unfolds the cloth with steady patience, revealing the papers hidden between the layers. He reads them silently. The wind moves gently across the fields behind him, carrying the scent of warm earth and late summer grain. In the distance, a church bell rings faintly from the direction of the village several kilometers away. The farmer folds the papers again and tucks them inside his coat. Soon he will pass the information along to someone else, perhaps a young man who rides at dusk toward the forest where the Maquis have begun to establish more permanent shelters beneath the trees. For now, however, the exchange remains quiet. The woman accepts a small sack of potatoes from the farmer and places it into her basket. To anyone who might see her leaving the farm, the visit will appear to have served only the simple purpose of trading food between neighbors. She thanks him and lifts the bicycle back onto the road. The journey continues. You follow her as the path stretches onward toward another village hidden beyond the rise of the hills. Each turn of the wheels carries the quiet weight of information that moves invisibly through the countryside. Journeys like this will repeat themselves again and again in the months ahead. And with each journey, the roads begin to remember more than footsteps and wheels. They begin to remember resistance. The road continues beyond the farm, rising gradually toward the ridge where the countryside begins to fold into deeper valleys. From this height, the land spreads outward in long waves of fields and orchards. Villages appear as small clusters of stone roofs gathered around church towers that have watched over these hills for centuries. You watch the woman ride steadily along the narrow lane as the afternoon light softens across the landscape. The sack of potatoes rests in her basket now, its weight pressing gently against the folded cloth that still lines the bottom. Anyone meeting her along the road would see nothing unusual. Farmers often exchange food in this way, especially as rationing grows tighter under the occupation. These small gestures of ordinary life help disguise the larger movement of supplies traveling quietly through the countryside. Beneath baskets of vegetables and bundles of firewood, other items sometimes move along the same roads. Extra bread gathered from sympathetic bakeries. Small tins of preserved meat hidden among sacks of grain. Occasionally, even pieces of equipment that must be carried carefully toward the forests where the Maquis wait beyond the reach of patrols. The journeys remain modest in scale. A single sack. A folded cloth parcel. Nothing large enough to attract suspicion if discovered. Yet over time these small deliveries begin to accumulate within the hidden encampments forming among the trees. You notice how the rhythm of travel has begun to settle into something steady. Morning rides toward markets and farms. Afternoon returns through the fields. Evening visits to houses where doors close quietly behind familiar faces. The roads connect these moments into a quiet circulation of people and supplies. As the woman reaches the crest of the ridge, she pauses briefly beside a low stone wall where the land drops away toward another valley. The bicycle rests against the stones while she removes the hat from her head and wipes a trace of dust from her forehead. From this vantage point, the countryside appears calm. A river winds through the valley floor, its surface catching the pale reflection of the sky. Fields stretch toward the distant tree line where the forests begin again. A small column of smoke rises from a farmhouse chimney far below, drifting slowly upward through the warm air. Nothing about the landscape reveals the quiet movement of resistance unfolding within it. Yet the hills and valleys have begun to carry that movement in ways invisible to those who pass through only briefly. You watch the woman stand beside the wall as she studies the road descending toward the village ahead. Her pause is not merely for rest. From this height she can observe the road for several kilometers, watching for any unusual activity that might signal danger along the route. A truck might appear where none should be. A group of soldiers might gather near the bridge that crosses the river below. For several minutes she remains still, allowing her eyes to follow the winding road through the valley. The path remains empty. Satisfied, she places the hat back on her head and lifts the bicycle once more. The descent carries her quickly toward the village where the next quiet exchange will occur. The wind moves through the spokes as the wheels gather speed, and the scent of river water rises from the valley floor as she approaches the cluster of houses standing beside the road. This village is smaller than the one she left earlier in the day. A handful of houses, a small cafe, and a narrow church whose bell rings softly when the hour turns. The streets appear quiet as she enters the village square. A few villagers sit outside the cafe beneath a faded awning, their chairs angled toward the road as they watch the afternoon drift slowly past. She dismounts near the well and guides the bicycle toward a wooden bench beneath the shade of a chestnut tree. A woman sits there already, mending a torn sleeve with careful attention. Their meeting appears entirely ordinary. The rider rests beside the bench while adjusting the sack of potatoes in her basket. The seated woman continues working with the needle, her gaze lowered toward the cloth in her hands. For several moments neither acknowledges the other. Then the rider lifts the sack from the basket and places it gently on the bench. The seated woman sets aside the sleeve she has been mending and reaches for the potatoes as though examining their quality before purchase. Her fingers move slowly across the rough surface of the sack until they find the small opening hidden beneath the folded cloth lining. Inside the cloth rests another paper. This message is different from the one delivered earlier at the farm. It contains instructions that have traveled from a forest encampment several kilometers away. A request for additional supplies. A warning about increased patrol activity along a particular stretch of road. The seated woman removes the paper with practiced ease and slips it beneath the cloth she has been sewing. The exchange lasts no longer than the time required to inspect the vegetables. You watch the quiet choreography unfold beneath the shade of the chestnut tree. Neither woman speaks of the message directly. Their conversation remains entirely ordinary, touching briefly on the dryness of the season and the difficulty of finding cooking oil. Anyone listening nearby would hear nothing beyond the familiar language of village life. When the rider lifts the sack again and returns it to her basket, the message has already disappeared into the folds of another journey. She mounts the bicycle and continues along the road that leads away from the square. The seated woman remains beneath the tree, finishing the repair to the torn sleeve before gathering her belongings. Later in the evening, she will walk along a path that leads toward the forest beyond the hills. There, beneath the trees, the message will travel again. You watch the bicycle disappear beyond the last house of the village. The road continues winding through fields and orchards where the late afternoon light drifts slowly across the land. The countryside appears peaceful beneath the broad sky of early evening. But the roads have begun to carry something new now. Not just travelers, not just food. They carry memory. The memory of each small journey made by those who move quietly between villages and forests. The memory of exchanges that appear ordinary to passing eyes, but carry deeper meaning for those who understand the hidden network forming across the countryside. Over time, these journeys will grow heavier. More messages, more supplies, more responsibility carried quietly from one place to another. For now, however, the woman riding along the road carries only the gentle weight of potatoes in her basket and the fading warmth of afternoon sunlight on her back. The resistance continues to move in small steps, and the countryside, patient as ever, continues to hold those steps within its quiet memory. The slow life of the Maquis. As autumn approaches, the forests begin to change. Leaves that once formed a dense green canopy slowly shift toward the muted gold and copper tones of early fall. The air grows cooler beneath the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen branches that soften the forest floor with each passing week. Paths that were once hidden beneath summer growth become more visible now as the foliage thins and sunlight reaches deeper into the woods. For those living within the Maquis, these seasonal changes bring quiet adjustments to daily life. You stand once more in the clearing along the ridge where the small group gathered earlier in the year. The space has begun to take on the subtle signs of longer habitation. A rough shelter made from branches and canvas stands near the edge of the trees, its low roof blending into the shadows beneath the canopy. Nearby, a stack of firewood rests beside a shallow pit where cooking fires are built carefully to keep smoke from rising too high above the treetops. The people moving through the clearing now carry themselves with the slow familiarity of those who have begun to settle into the rhythms of forest life. A man kneels beside the fire pit, stirring a pot suspended above the coals. Another figure sits near the fallen trunk, mending a tear in a blanket that has grown thin from repeated use. The quiet sounds of these tasks blend with the natural voice of the forest, the rustle of leaves overhead, the distant call of birds preparing for migration. Nothing about the scene suggests urgency. Life inside the Maquis moves according to a different measure of time. You notice how much of the day passes through simple routines that repeat again and again. Water must be gathered from a spring farther down the slope. Firewood must be collected from fallen branches scattered across the forest floor. Food brought from nearby villages must be rationed carefully to ensure that supplies last until the next courier arrives. These tasks consume hours that stretch quietly across the day. Waiting fills the spaces between them. You watch a woman kneel beside the shelter, where several cloth bundles are arranged in a neat row along the ground. She unties one of the bundles and begins sorting its contents with deliberate care. Inside she finds several loaves of dark bread wrapped in linen, a small jar of preserved fruit, and a handful of onions gathered from a farm several kilometers away. The supplies have arrived that morning, carried along forest paths by a courier who left before sunrise to avoid traveling the roads during daylight. She divides the food into smaller portions, setting aside enough for the evening meal while storing the remainder beneath a wooden crate that has been placed over a shallow pit in the earth. The crate serves as a simple form of protection against animals and weather. You notice the quiet discipline with which these tasks are performed. Food cannot be wasted here. Each loaf of bread represents a journey made by someone moving through the countryside under the watchful presence of occupation patrols. Each jar of fruit has traveled from a kitchen where a family has chosen to share a portion of its limited stores with those living beyond the reach of village life. The forest absorbs these small acts of support the way it absorbs footsteps. Gradually, without announcement. Nearby, another woman sits on a fallen branch cleaning a small medical kit laid open beside her. Inside the kit rest several bandages, a bottle of iodine, and a pair of scissors worn dull from repeated use. She inspects each item carefully before wrapping them again in cloth. In the early months of the Maquis, injuries were treated with whatever supplies could be found within the villages. Now the need for more organized care has begun to appear. Scratches from thorns and branches are common among those who spend long days moving through the forest. Occasionally, a deeper wound arrives with someone who has fled suddenly from a village after a raid or arrest. The medical kit travels quietly between shelters, carried by those who know how to use its contents. You watch as the woman finishes her work and closes the cloth bundle with steady hands. Around her, the clearing continues its slow rhythm of quiet activity. Two men return from the edge of the forest, carrying additional branches for the firewood pile. Another figure crouches beside a rough map drawn in the dirt with a stick, tracing the outline of nearby roads while explaining a route that avoids the bridge where German patrols have begun appearing more frequently. These conversations remain calm and practical. The Maquis is still small. Most of those gathered here know one another by name or through connections that stretch back into the villages where they once lived openly. The forest has not yet transformed them into soldiers. Instead, it has placed them inside a different kind of community shaped by patience and mutual dependence. Women continue to move between this hidden world and the villages below. You watch one of them preparing to leave the clearing as the afternoon light drifts across the forest floor. She adjusts the strap of a satchel resting against her side and checks the contents carefully before stepping onto the narrow path leading downhill. Inside the satchel rest several folded messages written earlier that morning. Instructions about food supplies. Observations regarding patrol routes near the river valley. Names of new arrivals who have reached the forest after slipping away from villages where forced labor orders have begun to circulate. She will carry these messages along the same roads that have quietly sustained the network since the first days of occupation. But before leaving, she pauses at the edge of the clearing. For a moment she looks back toward the small group gathered beneath the trees. The forest has become a place of refuge for them, a place where the war can be watched from a distance rather than endured in the streets of occupied villages. Yet refuge comes with its own quiet burdens. You begin to understand how life inside the Maquis requires more than courage. It requires patience measured in long days of waiting. Waiting for food deliveries. Waiting for information from the villages. Waiting for the uncertain moment when the quiet routines of survival might give way to something more dangerous. For now, however, the forest remains calm. The woman steps onto the path and begins the careful descent toward the countryside beyond the trees. Behind her, the clearing settles once again into the slow rhythm of daily life among the Maquis. Leaves drift gently from the branches overhead, and the forest continues to shelter those who have chosen to wait within its quiet boundaries. As the woman disappears down the path, the clearing grows quiet again. The forest closes gently around the space she has left behind, as though the branches themselves prefer the small gathering beneath them to remain unnoticed. A breeze moves through the upper leaves, scattering a few early autumn fragments that spiral slowly to the ground. You watch the people who remain in the clearing return to the small routines that sustain them. One of the men lifts the pot from the fire pit and pours its contents into several dented bowls. The soup is simple, water thickened with onions and a few potatoes carried earlier that morning from a farm in the valley. Steam rises softly into the cool air as the bowls are passed around the circle. They eat without ceremony. Food inside the Maquis rarely becomes a moment of celebration. Instead, it serves as a quiet confirmation that the network connecting forest and village continues to function. Each meal reflects the cooperation of people who may never step inside the forest themselves, but who support those hidden beneath the trees. The woman who sorted the supplies earlier accepts her bowl and sits beside the fallen trunk. She listens while the others speak about the changes unfolding across the countryside. Another farm has begun sending bread twice each week instead of once. A courier from the Southern Valley reports that new patrols have appeared along the railway line. Someone mentions that several young men from a nearby village have slipped away into the woods after receiving letters ordering them to travel east for labor service in Germany. These developments arrive slowly, carried by travelers who move quietly between villages and forest paths. You notice how carefully the group receives each piece of information. No one interrupts. No one reacts with sudden urgency. Instead, the details settle into the shared understanding of the Maquis, the way fallen leaves settle across the forest floor. The woman who tends the medical kit lifts her head slightly when the conversation turns to the arrival of new fugitives. She has seen this pattern before. When forced labor orders begin circulating through the villages, the forests fill quickly with men who have chosen disappearance over departure. Many arrive with little preparation. Some carry only the clothes they were wearing when the letter arrived. The Maquis becomes their refuge. But refuge brings new challenges. More people require more food. More shelter must be built from branches and salvaged cloth. The quiet routines of forest life begin to stretch beneath the growing weight of those seeking protection among the trees. You watch one of the men rise from the circle and walk toward the edge of the clearing where the forest thickens again. Beyond the first line of trunks, additional shelters have begun appearing along the slope. They are simple structures, little more than frames of thin poles covered with canvas or blankets gathered from sympathetic homes in nearby villages. Each shelter rests low against the ground so that it cannot be seen easily from a distance. The forest conceals them with quiet generosity. Yet even here caution remains necessary. Smoke from cooking fires must be kept low and brief. Footpaths between shelters must avoid creating clear trails that might attract attention if someone unfamiliar wanders through the woods. Every new arrival must learn the slow discipline required to live unnoticed among the trees. You notice how the man checks the shelters one by one, adjusting a branch here, tightening a rope there. These tasks repeat themselves each day. Maintenance becomes another form of waiting. When he returns to the clearing, the bowls have already been emptied. The group settles into the gentle stillness that often follows a shared meal. Some lean back against the trees with eyes half closed. Others sit quietly while the afternoon light shifts across the forest floor. The woman who had prepared to leave earlier now travels far below the ridge, her bicycle rolling along a narrow road where the forest opens again into fields. You follow her descent in memory as the clearing continues its quiet rhythm above. Her journey back toward the villages carries messages that must move carefully through the same network that delivered food and supplies earlier in the day. These exchanges form a steady current of movement between the hidden world of the Maquis and the ordinary life continuing beneath occupation. Without that current, the forest could not sustain those who live within it. You begin to understand how much the Maquis depends upon the women who move between these two worlds. They carry food, information, and sometimes medicine along the same quiet roads used by farmers and market travelers. Their presence in the villages allows them to listen and observe in ways that those hidden in the forest cannot. A conversation overheard beside a bakery window. A patrol schedule noticed while standing in line at a railway station. A rumor shared by a neighbor who has seen trucks moving along unfamiliar routes. Each fragment travels back to the forest where it becomes part of the collective awareness that guides the Maquis through the uncertain months ahead. The clearing grows darker as the afternoon fades toward evening. Shadows stretch between the trees while the temperature drops slightly beneath the canopy. Someone adds fresh branches to the fire pit, careful to keep the flames low enough that the smoke will disappear among the leaves before rising above the treetops. The forest prepares for night. You watch the group settle into their evening routines. A blanket is spread beside the fallen trunk. The medical kit is placed carefully beneath the shelter roof. A small lantern is lit briefly while someone checks a handwritten list of supplies needed for the coming days. These gestures carry no urgency. Yet within their quiet repetition lies the slow strengthening of the Maquis itself. Each day spent surviving in the forest deepens the bonds between those who share its shelter. Each message carried along the countryside roads strengthens the network connecting hidden encampments with the villages that support them. Resistance here does not announce itself with sudden action. Instead, it grows quietly through patience, through the steady accumulation of small tasks performed beneath the watchful silence of the trees. Night settles gradually across the ridge. The last light fades from the clearing while the wind moves softly through the branches overhead. Somewhere beyond the hills, a distant engine hums briefly before disappearing into the wide darkness of the countryside. But within the forest, the Maquis remains, waiting, listening, and learning how to endure the long quiet hours that stretch between one small journey and the next. The tightening net. Winter approaches quietly in the hills. The first sign appears in the air before it touches the ground. Mornings grow sharper, the cold settling into the valleys before sunrise and lingering beneath the trees long after daylight returns. Frost begins to gather along the edges of fields and across the wooden rails of fences where moisture freezes into delicate white patterns. You watch the countryside adjust to the change in season. Farmers move more slowly through the fields now, their breath visible in the cold air as they prepare the last work before winter settles across the land. Smoke rises more frequently from chimneys as fires burn longer inside village homes. The roads carry fewer travelers during the early hours of morning, when frost stiffens the ground beneath bicycle wheels. Yet within this quiet shift of weather, another change has begun to move across the countryside. The occupation authorities have started to pay closer attention to the forests. At first, the change is subtle. Patrols appear along roads that once remained empty except for farmers and market travelers. Trucks stop occasionally beside small villages where soldiers step down to question those who pass along the streets. Notices are posted beside the doors of town halls, written in formal language that speaks of increased vigilance and the need to report suspicious activity. You watch villagers gather around these notices with quiet expressions. The words themselves reveal little. They mention sabotage in distant regions, attacks on railway lines, rumors of armed groups hiding within the countryside. But even without clear details, people begin to understand what the authorities suspect. The forests are no longer ignored. This awareness spreads quickly through the villages that support the Maquis. Women standing in bread lines hear the news first through murmured conversations. Someone mentions that soldiers searched a farmhouse 2 valleys away. Another speaks of patrols moving through woodland paths where hunters once walked freely. The information travels along the same quiet routes that have carried messages between villages and forest encampments. You watch a woman leave the village square carrying a basket wrapped tightly with cloth. Her steps move with a calm rhythm of routine, yet her attention remains sharper than before. She notices the soldiers standing near the cafe where their truck rests beside the road. Their presence has become more frequent during recent weeks. She passes them without hesitation. The basket resting against her arm contains loaves of bread and a small jar of preserved fruit gathered from several homes earlier that morning. Beneath the food rests a folded message intended for the Maquis waiting within the forest beyond the hills. The message contains only a few lines. German patrols moving along the river road twice each day. A search conducted near the railway bridge 3 nights earlier. Advice to avoid the southern trail leading into the forest. You notice how the weight of such information has begun to grow. During the early months of resistance, most messages concerned simple matters of travel, safe hours to move along the roads, friendly farms where food could be obtained quietly. Now the network must also carry warnings. The roads are no longer watched casually. They are watched deliberately. You follow the woman as she leaves the village and begins walking toward the countryside path that leads to the forest ridge. Frost still clings to the grass along the edges of the road, crunching softly beneath her shoes as she moves past the last cluster of houses. Behind her, the village returns to its quiet rhythm. A cart rattles slowly across the square. The church bell rings faintly in the distance. Smoke drifts upward from chimneys into the pale winter sky. From the outside, nothing appears unusual. Yet the network of quiet observation that has grown across the countryside begins to respond to the tightening attention of the occupation authorities. You notice how the routes used by couriers begin to change. Some paths are abandoned temporarily when patrols appear too frequently. Others are used only at certain hours when the roads remain quiet. Forest trails once traveled openly now require longer detours through rougher terrain where travelers must move carefully to avoid leaving visible tracks in the frost. The woman walking toward the forest ridge turns onto one of these alternate routes. Instead of following the main road that leads directly toward the trees, she crosses a narrow field where the ground slopes gently upward toward a line of hedges. Her steps move slowly here, avoiding patches of frozen earth that might carry the sound of her passage across the open ground. You watch the sky above the fields where thin clouds drift slowly across the pale winter light. The countryside appears calm. But beneath that calm, the network connecting village and forest begins to adjust its movements with quiet discipline. Every message now carries an added purpose, not only to sustain the Maquis, but to help it remain unseen. The woman reaches the hedgerow and slips through a narrow opening between the branches where a faint path leads toward the forest. The trees stand darker now against the winter sky, their branches bare enough that the ground beneath them receives more light than it did during summer months. The forest no longer conceals movement as easily as before. This change has not gone unnoticed by those living within its shelter. You stand at the edge of the clearing where the Maquis has slowly built its small encampment over the past seasons. The shelters appear more carefully arranged now, their shapes pressed low against the earth and covered with branches to blend into the surrounding terrain. Men move quietly between them, gathering firewood and checking the paths that lead toward the ridge. They have also heard the news carried from the villages. patrols increasing along the roads, searches conducted in nearby valleys. The forest remains their refuge, but the sense of distance that once protected them has begun to narrow. You watch the woman arrive along the path and step into the clearing where the others wait. The basket is placed gently on the ground. The folded message emerges from beneath the cloth, and as the information spreads quietly through the small circle gathered beneath the trees, the Maquis begins to feel the slow tightening of the net forming beyond the forest. The message passes quietly from hand to hand. Each person in the clearing reads the few lines written in careful script, then folds the paper again before passing it onward. No one raises their voice. The forest carries sound easily during the winter months, when the leaves have fallen and the branches no longer absorb every whisper. Even here, deep within the shelter of the ridge, caution has become a habit that shapes every gesture. You watch the group gather closer around the small fire pit, where only a thin flame burns beneath a shallow pot. The warmth from the fire drifts slowly across the clearing, barely visible in the pale winter air. The woman who carried the message sits beside the fallen trunk, her hands resting quietly in her lap as the others finish reading. The words she brought are not dramatic. They speak only of movement along the roads, of patrols appearing at bridges and crossroads where travelers once passed freely. But these small observations carry weight now. Over the past months, the Maquis has grown larger. More shelters stand hidden among the trees along the ridge. More people move quietly through the forest paths, connecting one clearing to another. Growth brings strength, but it also brings risk. One of the men lifts a stick and draws a rough map in the soil beside the fire pit. The shape of the ridge appears first, followed by the narrow valley roads that wind through the surrounding hills. He marks the bridge mentioned in the message with a small circle scratched into the earth. A second mark appears farther south. Another patrol reported there 2 days earlier. You watch the quiet concentration with which they study the map forming beneath the stick. No formal orders are given. Instead, the group discusses the information with careful calm, adjusting their understanding of the countryside piece by piece. The woman who tends the medical kit leans forward slightly, listening as one of the others explains that the southern trail into the forest should be avoided for the coming weeks. Patrols have begun crossing the valley more frequently, and travelers seen near the trees might attract unwanted attention. These adjustments ripple outward through the Maquis. Paths that once carried couriers openly are now used only at night. Messages must sometimes travel farther through unfamiliar terrain to avoid the roads where soldiers have begun to linger. The forest itself begins to feel smaller, not because its trees have changed, but because the space around it is being watched more carefully than before. You notice how this awareness settles quietly into the routines of those living within the clearing. After the discussion ends, the man erases the map with the sole of his boot. The marks disappear into the soil as though they had never existed. The paper message is folded again and placed inside a tin box where other notes are stored before being burned later that evening. Nothing is kept longer than necessary. The woman who carried the basket rises and walks toward the edge of the clearing where the path leads back toward the villages. She will not leave immediately. Travel after midday has become more dangerous during recent weeks. Soldiers often move along the roads during the late afternoon hours, and the winter landscape offers fewer places to hide if a patrol approaches unexpectedly. Instead, she waits beside the path while the others return to their tasks. Waiting has always been part of life in the Maquis, but now the waiting carries a different weight. You watch the clearing settle once again into its quiet rhythm. Firewood is gathered and stacked beneath the shelters. A pot of water is placed near the coals to warm slowly against the cold air. Someone checks the bundles of food stored beneath the wooden crate to ensure that the supplies remain dry. These small routines continue because they must. The tightening attention of the occupation authorities does not erase the daily needs of those living within the forest. Food must still be eaten. Water must still be carried from the spring below the ridge. Messages must still move between the villages and the hidden shelters where the Maquis waits. But the awareness of danger now moves alongside these routines. You notice it in the way people pause more often when walking along the forest paths, listening for unfamiliar sounds beyond the trees. You see it in the careful way supplies are hidden beneath layers of branches, rather than left resting openly beside the shelters. Even the fire is built with greater caution now, its smoke kept low and brief so that it disappears quickly among the bare branches overhead. As the afternoon fades toward evening, the woman who carried the message finally lifts her basket again. The return journey must begin before darkness settles completely across the countryside. Curfew will soon empty the village streets, and anyone traveling the roads after that hour risks attracting attention that cannot easily be explained. You follow her as she steps onto the narrow path descending from the ridge. Behind her, the Maquis remains hidden among the trees. The shelters blend quietly into the forest floor. The faint glow of the fire pit disappears beneath a covering of ashes carefully spread across the embers. Within minutes, the clearing looks much as it did before anyone arrived there at all. The forest knows how to conceal. The woman moves carefully along the trail, her footsteps slow against the frozen ground. The winter air grows colder as the sun sinks toward the horizon beyond the hills. Soon the fields will darken, and the villages will close their doors against the night. You watch her leave the forest behind and step once more into the open countryside where the roads wind quietly through frost-covered fields. From a distance, the world still appears calm. The church bell rings faintly across the valley. Smoke rises from farmhouse chimneys where evening fires have already been lit. A cart creaks slowly along a distant road where a farmer returns home before curfew begins. Yet beneath this peaceful surface, the quiet network connecting villages and forest continues to adjust its movements with careful discipline. The roads are watched now. The forests are suspected. And the Maquis must learn to survive beneath a sky that has begun to look more closely at the hills where resistance waits in silence. The long winter of silence. Winter settles fully across the countryside, not with sudden storms, but with a slow quieting of the land. The fields grow pale beneath thin frost that lingers through the morning hours. Bare branches stretch across the sky where the summer canopy once softened the light. Even the rivers seem to move more slowly now, their surfaces reflecting the grey calm of the winter sky. You watch the villages withdraw gently into themselves. Doors close earlier in the afternoon. Smoke rises steadily from chimneys where fires burn longer against the cold. The narrow streets grow quiet soon after sunset as curfew settles across the countryside like a blanket of stillness. For those living inside the Maquis, winter brings a different rhythm of endurance. The forest shelters them, but it also exposes them in new ways. Without the thick foliage of summer, the branches no longer hide every movement beneath the trees. Footprints appear clearly along the forest paths where frost hardens the ground overnight. Smoke from cooking fires must be kept even smaller than before, because the bare canopy offers little cover for drifting columns of grey. You stand once again within the clearing along the ridge where the Maquis has established its fragile refuge. Snow has not yet fallen, but the air carries the promise of it. A thin layer of frost coats the fallen leaves beneath the trees, and each step across the clearing produces a faint crunch that echoes farther than expected through the quiet woods. The shelters appear smaller now against the pale winter light. Branches and canvas pressed low against the earth. Blankets tied carefully across wooden frames to block the wind. Each structure blends into the forest floor with careful attention to shape and shadow. You watch a woman emerge from one of these shelters carrying a small pot in both hands. Her breath rises in the cold air as she walks toward the fire pit, where a few embers glow faintly beneath the ash. She kneels beside the stones and begins stirring the coals with a stick, coaxing a small flame to life beneath the pot. The fire must remain small. During winter months, smoke rises more clearly through the branches. A column too large might be seen from the hills beyond the forest, where patrols occasionally move along the valley roads. The woman works patiently, adding only a few thin twigs to the fire. Nearby, two men sit beside the fallen trunk, mending a pair of worn boots. Leather has become difficult to replace under the occupation, and every piece of clothing must last as long as possible. One of them holds a needle threaded with rough twine, while the other steadies the boot across his knee. Their conversation moves quietly between them. Not about battles. Not about plans. Instead, they speak about the cold, about the difficulty of gathering enough firewood without leaving visible signs along the forest floor, about the rumor that a nearby farm may soon provide an extra sack of potatoes if the next courier arrives safely. Life in the Maquis during winter becomes an exercise in careful patience. Food arrives less frequently when snow or frost makes travel along the countryside roads more difficult. Messages move more slowly because couriers must avoid leaving tracks in open fields where patrols might notice them the following day. You watch the woman lift the pot from the fire and carry it toward the shelter where several others remain wrapped in blankets against the cold. Inside the canvas walls the air feels slightly warmer, though the wind still slips through the small gaps where branches meet cloth. She pours the contents of the pot into a row of metal cups arranged along the ground. The drink is little more than warm water flavored with dried herbs gathered from a nearby hillside months earlier. Yet the warmth spreads slowly through the small group as they drink. You begin to understand how winter transforms the meaning of survival inside the forest. In summer, the Maquis grew through movement, messages traveling along the roads, supplies carried from farms and markets. Winter slows that movement. The network connecting village and forest must adapt to the season's silence. Women who carry messages now travel shorter routes. Instead of riding bicycles along open roads, some walk narrow paths through hedgerows where their footprints will disappear beneath the frost before morning. Others wait several days between journeys, choosing the quietest hours when few travelers move through the countryside. Waiting becomes even more important. You notice how the group in the shelter listens carefully to the faint sounds beyond the clearing. In winter, the forest carries distant noises more clearly. A truck engine traveling along the valley road can sometimes be heard for several minutes before it disappears into the distance. These sounds help them measure the world beyond the trees. The woman who prepared the drink sits near the shelter entrance and pulls a blanket around her shoulders. Her thoughts drift toward the villages below. Many of the women who support the Maquis continue living ordinary lives there, standing in bread lines, tending farms, visiting neighbors who may or may not know about the hidden shelters beneath the ridge. Their movements through the villages remain calm and unremarkable. Yet each journey carries quiet risk. The tightening attention of the occupation authorities has not faded with the arrival of winter. Patrols continue moving along the valley roads. Soldiers still appear in the village squares where markets once gathered freely before the war. You watch the woman in the shelter stare toward the forest path leading downhill. Soon another courier should arrive. The journey will be slower now, the ground too hard for bicycles in some places and too visible for footprints in others. But the network connecting forest and village has survived months of careful adjustment. It will continue. For now, however, the Maquis settles deeper into the long winter of waiting. Outside the shelter, the pale light of afternoon begins to fade behind the trees. The frost-covered clearing grows quieter as the forest prepares for another cold night beneath the silent sky. Evening arrives early in the winter forest. The light fades gradually between the bare branches, turning the clearing into a place of long shadows and muted color. Frost gathers again across the ground where the warmth of the afternoon briefly softened the leaves beneath the trees. The air grows still in the quiet way that often precedes a cold night. You watch the small group in the clearing move through their evening routines with careful familiarity. The pot is emptied and set beside the stones of the fire pit, where the embers glow faintly beneath a layer of ash. A few thin branches are added to keep the warmth alive, but the flame remains small. Too much smoke would rise clearly against the darkening sky. Nearby, one of the men lifts a bundle of firewood and carries it beneath the shelter roof where the branches will remain dry until morning. Another kneels beside the medical kit, checking the contents by the dim light of a small lantern that is quickly extinguished once the task is finished. These quiet gestures fill the hours between daylight and sleep. You notice how the clearing has grown quieter over the past weeks. The colder weather keeps people closer to the shelters, and conversation moves more slowly when breath must be warmed between each sentence. Yet the silence does not feel empty. It carries the weight of patience that has grown through months of shared endurance. The woman sitting near the entrance of the shelter continues watching the narrow forest path. Soon the courier should arrive. Winter has made these journeys more uncertain. Roads that once carried bicycles now lie stiff beneath frost or patches of frozen mud. Footpaths through open fields must be chosen carefully, so that the tracks left behind will not remain visible when daylight returns. For those carrying messages between the villages and the Maquis, every step must be measured against the possibility of discovery. The forest listens with her. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the wind moves softly across the hills, carrying the faint creak of branches rubbing against one another in the dark. An owl calls once from deeper within the woods before the sound fades into the stillness. Then another sound appears. Footsteps. Soft at first. Slow. You watch the figures in the clearing turn their heads slightly toward the path without speaking. No one rises yet. The forest often carries stray noises, animals crossing the leaves, wind shifting fallen branches. But the rhythm of these footsteps carries a human pace. The woman near the shelter stands quietly. The others remain seated beside the fire pit. Moments later, a figure emerges from the darkness between the trees. A woman steps into the clearing with a wool scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. Frost clings to the hem of her coat where it brushed against frozen grass along the lower paths. In one hand, she carries a small satchel that rests against her side as she pauses at the edge of the clearing. Recognition passes silently through the group. She moves closer and sets the satchel on the ground beside the fire pit. Inside are several small items gathered during the day's quiet travel through the villages. A folded message written on rough paper. 2 loaves of bread wrapped carefully in cloth. A small bottle of medicine obtained from a sympathetic doctor who continues treating villagers beneath the watch of occupation patrols. The woman who prepared the warm drink earlier kneels beside the satchel and begins sorting its contents. The bread is placed beside the crate where the other supplies remain hidden beneath the shelter floor. The medicine is carried immediately to the medical kit, where it will be used sparingly if illness or injury appears during the winter months. Finally, the folded message is opened. You watch the group lean closer to hear the quiet reading of the words written inside. The message carries news from the villages. German patrols have continued searching farms near the southern valley. 2 men from a neighboring village were taken for questioning earlier that week, and yet the families who support the Maquis remain calm, continuing their quiet routines while passing food and information through the same careful channels that have sustained the network since the first days of resistance. The news brings no sudden reaction. Instead, the words settle slowly into the quiet understanding shared by those in the clearing. Winter will not end the resistance, but it will test it. You notice how the courier sits beside the fire pit after the message has been read. Her journey through the cold countryside has been long, and the warmth of the small fire spreads slowly through her hands as she holds them near the coals. The woman beside her offers a cup of the remaining warm drink. They speak quietly about the roads, about which paths remain safest to travel while the ground stays frozen, about the farmers who continue leaving small bundles of food along hedgerows where couriers can retrieve them without being seen. These conversations form the quiet lifeline of the Maquis during winter. Movement has slowed, but it has not stopped. The forest shelters those who wait, and the villages continue sending small signs of support through the cold countryside. Outside the clearing, the night deepens across the hills. The sky above the trees fills with faint stars that appear sharper in the winter air. Somewhere far below the ridge, a truck engine hums briefly along the valley road before disappearing into the distance. The war continues to move beyond the forest. Yet within the Maquis, the long winter of silence becomes a time of preparation, a time when patience grows stronger than fear. The fire pit glows softly beneath the gathering darkness, while the group settles once again into the quiet rhythm of endurance that has carried them through the cold months beneath the watchful silence of the trees. When the forest begins to listen. Spring does not arrive all at once in the hills. It begins quietly beneath the soil long before the branches above reveal the change. The frost loosens its hold on the forest floor. Thin streams begin to move again along the shallow channels that winter left silent. Beneath the trees, small shoots push upward through layers of fallen leaves that have rested undisturbed through the cold months. You watch the forest breathe again. The Maquis feels this change slowly. At first, the difference appears only in the air. Mornings no longer carry the sharp bite of frost. Breath no longer lingers in pale clouds beneath the branches. The ground softens enough that footsteps leave shallow marks where winter once preserved every trace. With the return of spring comes movement. The narrow paths descending from the ridge begin to carry travelers more often again. Couriers move between villages with fewer delays. Bicycles reappear along the countryside roads where frost once hardened the soil too tightly for safe travel. The quiet network that survived the winter begins to expand once more. You stand at the edge of the clearing where the shelters remain pressed low against the earth. Their shapes have weathered the cold months beneath layers of branches and canvas. Moss has begun creeping across the fallen trunk beside the fire pit, and the first green shoots appear along the edges of the path leading deeper into the forest. A woman steps into the clearing carrying a bundle of cloth tied carefully with twine. Her arrival brings the small group together as it has many times before. They gather near the fire pit while she unties the cloth and reveals the supplies hidden within. Bread, a small sack of dried beans, and a folded message written hurriedly on paper that has traveled through several hands during the past 2 days. You watch the man nearest the fire unfold the paper and read the message slowly. The words speak of change. In recent weeks, trains carrying German equipment have begun passing more frequently through the railway stations in nearby towns. Convoys move along the valley roads at unusual hours. Soldiers appear more often near bridges and crossroads where they had once remained only occasionally. The countryside has begun to notice. You see it in the quiet expressions of the villagers who gather near the railway platforms. You hear it in the low conversations that drift through markets where farmers exchange goods and news beneath the watch of distant patrols. Something is shifting across the wider war. The Maquis may not yet know the full meaning of these movements, but the forest has begun to listen more carefully. The message passes quietly between the small group gathered in the clearing. When it reaches the woman who carried the bundle, she reads the lines once more before folding the paper again. Her eyes drift toward the ridge where the path leads down into the valley. She has seen the signs herself. While traveling between villages during the previous week, she noticed more trains moving along the tracks near the river. Soldiers unloading crates beneath the watch of officers who studied maps spread across wooden tables beside the platform. No one explained the purpose of these preparations. But the countryside remembers patterns. Farmers who once served as soldiers during earlier wars notice the change in traffic along the roads. Railway workers observe the increased movement of equipment through their stations. Bakers standing near their windows watch the trucks passing through village squares more frequently than before. These small observations travel along the same quiet channels that have sustained the Maquis from the beginning. You watch the group sit quietly around the fire pit as the message settles into their understanding. Spring has returned, and with it, the sense that the war beyond the forests may soon press closer to the hills where they have spent the long months of waiting. The clearing remains calm. No sudden plans are spoken. Instead, the conversation turns slowly toward practical matters. The shelters must be repaired where winter winds loosened their coverings. Supplies must be gathered more frequently now that additional people have begun arriving from villages where forced labor orders continue to circulate. The forest must remain prepared. You notice how the woman who carried the message begins organizing the food supplies brought in the cloth bundle. The dried beans are poured carefully into a small tin container. The bread is wrapped again in linen and placed beneath the crate where other stores remain hidden from animals. These tasks appear simple, yet within them lies the quiet discipline that has allowed the Maquis to survive through months of uncertainty. Nearby, another woman kneels beside the medical kit and examines the small bottle of medicine delivered during the winter. Only a little remains. Soon another journey must be arranged to obtain more supplies from the doctor, who continues to assist the network quietly within the village. The forest listens as the group speaks softly about these matters. Birdsong has returned to the branches overhead. The air carries the fresh scent of soil warming beneath the sun. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a stream moves more quickly than it did during the cold months, its sound drifting faintly through the trees. You begin to feel how the season itself encourages movement. Couriers will soon travel more often along the countryside roads. Messages will move faster between villages and the forest. The quiet network that endured winter's stillness begins preparing for the changes that spring often brings to war. For now, however, the clearing remains a place of quiet observation. The message rests folded beside the fire pit. The people who have spent the winter beneath these trees continue their patient routines, and the forest, waking slowly from its long silence, begins to listen more closely to the distant sounds of a war that may soon reach the hills. The message is folded again and placed inside the small tin box where other notes wait briefly before they are burned. Nothing written remains long inside the forest. Paper carries risk. Memory travels more safely among those who share the quiet responsibility of remembering. You watch the clearing settle once more into the rhythm of small tasks. The woman who brought the bundle ties the cloth carefully and places it beside the crate where the remaining supplies are stored. Another person lifts the pot from the fire pit and rinses it with water gathered from the spring earlier that morning. The water splashes softly against the metal, then disappears into the moss at the edge of the clearing. Around them, the forest continues its slow return to life. Leaves have begun appearing along the higher branches where winter left the trees bare. Sunlight moves more freely through the canopy now, warming patches of earth that remained frozen only weeks before. The ground beneath the shelters softens, releasing the faint scent of soil and damp wood. Spring brings energy to the forest, but it also carries sound. Birdsong echoes more clearly among the trees. Small animals move through the undergrowth, stirring leaves that winter kept still. Even the streams that cross the hills speak louder now as melted frost feeds their steady flow toward the valleys. For those living inside the Maquis, these sounds bring both comfort and caution. You notice how the people in the clearing pause more often to listen, not out of fear, but out of awareness. The forest no longer belongs entirely to winter's silence. With spring's return, the countryside around the hills begins to move again. Farmers resume work in the fields. Travelers appear along the roads. Soldiers continue their patrols through villages where they question strangers and examine carts passing toward the markets. Each movement beyond the forest sends faint signals toward the ridge. The woman who organized the food supplies walks toward the path leading downhill. Her satchel rests lightly against her side. Inside are several folded notes prepared during the morning conversation in the clearing. These messages carry small pieces of information gathered over recent weeks, observations about the increased movement of trains, reminders about safe routes through the valleys, and requests for additional supplies from the farms that quietly support the Maquis. Soon she will carry these messages back to the villages. But before leaving, she stops near the edge of the clearing where the trees open briefly toward the slope below. From this vantage point, the land stretches across a series of low hills and valleys that fade into the pale distance. You stand beside her and look out across the countryside. The villages appear calm beneath the spring sky. Smoke rises from chimneys where morning fires warm the kitchens. Fields show the first lines of fresh soil where farmers have begun turning the earth for planting. Nothing about the view reveals the quiet tension building beneath its peaceful surface. Yet those who live here have begun to notice the signs. More trains, more trucks, more soldiers moving along the roads that wind through the valleys. The war beyond the hills is shifting. You see it in the thoughtful expression on the woman's face as she studies the distant landscape. Her role within the network of couriers has taught her how to read the countryside with careful attention. The smallest changes in routine can signal something larger unfolding beyond the horizon. She turns back toward the clearing where the others continue their work. Soon the messages will begin their journey through the villages. For now, however, the Maquis remains still. The clearing holds its quiet balance beneath the branches while the group prepares for the slow tasks that fill the afternoon. Firewood must be gathered before evening arrives. The shelters require small repairs where winter storms loosen their coverings. Someone must walk the northern path to check whether the spring still runs clear after the recent thaw. These duties appear ordinary. Yet each task strengthens the fragile life that has grown beneath the forest canopy. You watch the woman lift her satchel and step onto the path descending toward the valley. Behind her, the clearing settles once more into the calm rhythm of preparation. A blanket is shaken free of leaves and folded beside the shelter entrance. The medical kit is closed and stored beneath a wooden crate. The fire pit is covered lightly with ash to reduce the smoke rising into the afternoon air. The forest continues listening. Birds move between branches where new leaves unfold slowly in the warm light. The wind carries faint sounds from the countryside below, distant wheels along a road, the soft ringing of a church bell marking the hour. These quiet signals travel upward through the hills until they reach the ridge where the Maquis waits. The long winter of silence has ended. Spring has returned, and with it, the sense that the hidden network connecting forest and village must soon prepare for changes moving slowly across the wider war. For now the forest holds its calm, but beneath the returning leaves and warming air, something in the countryside has begun to stir. The quiet work of sabotage. By late spring, the countryside begins to carry a different kind of movement. The fields are greener now. Wheat rises steadily in the valleys, and orchards blossom with pale flowers that drift gently through the warm air. From a distance, the landscape appears peaceful, almost untouched by the wider conflict moving across Europe. But beneath that calm, the quiet network that grew slowly through observation and patience begins to change its purpose. You watch the roads that thread through the countryside. Bicycles still pass between villages as they have for months. Women carry baskets to market, farmers guide carts along the narrow lanes, and children walk toward the small schools that continue operating beneath the watch of occupation authorities. Yet alongside these ordinary journeys, another kind of travel has begun. The couriers who once carried only messages and food now sometimes carry instructions. These instructions move carefully through the same hidden channels that sustained the Maquis through the winter. They arrive folded inside cloth bundles or memorized by those who know how to carry words without writing them down. You stand beside the railway line that crosses the valley several kilometers from the forest ridge. The tracks cut through a narrow stretch of land where fields meet the riverbank. Tall grasses grow along the edges of the gravel bed, swaying softly in the wind that moves across the valley floor. The line appears quiet during the early hours of morning, but trains have been passing more frequently. You notice the signs in the gravel beside the rails, fresh marks where heavy wheels have pressed the stones deeper into the earth. Nearby, wooden sleepers show the dark stain of oil from the engines that carry cargo toward distant fronts. The countryside has been watching these changes carefully. Women standing beside the station platforms have counted the trains that arrive and depart each day. Railway workers quietly remember the destinations written on freight manifests. Farmers tending fields near the tracks observe the convoys moving through the valley at unusual hours. These observations have traveled slowly through the villages and into the forests where the Maquis waits. Now the forest begins to respond. You follow two figures walking along a narrow path that approaches the railway from behind a line of trees. They move slowly, pausing often to listen before stepping forward again. Both carry small satchels slung across their shoulders. The contents are simple: a wrench, a short length of metal rod, a folded piece of paper containing instructions copied from a message that arrived in the forest only 2 days earlier. You notice how carefully they approach the railway line. This is not the kind of work that begins with noise or sudden action. Instead, it requires the same patience that shaped the Maquis from the beginning. They wait beside the trees until the valley remains quiet long enough to feel certain that no train approaches. Only then do they step onto the gravel beside the tracks. The taller of the two kneels beside a section of rail where the metal fasteners hold the line against the wooden sleepers. His hands move calmly as he removes the wrench from the satchel and fits it around the head of one of the bolts. The tool turns slowly. You hear the faint scrape of metal against metal as the bolt loosens. Nearby, the second figure stands watch along the track that curves through the valley. Her attention moves constantly between the distant bend where trains appear and the fields stretching toward the riverbank. This work demands quiet precision. A single bolt removed carefully can weaken the stability of the rail. Several loosened along a short stretch may cause a train to slow or halt entirely while repairs are made. The goal is rarely destruction. Instead, the intention is delay. Time matters now. You watch the bolt slide free from its place beside the sleeper. The man places it carefully inside his satchel before moving to the next fastening point along the rail. Each movement repeats the same patient rhythm. Turn, pause, listen, then turn again. Minutes pass slowly beside the railway line. The valley remains calm. In the distance, a farmer guides a horse through a field where rows of young plants push upward through the soil. Birds move among the grasses beside the river, their wings catching the light as they rise briefly before settling again. From afar, the scene would appear peaceful. Yet beneath that quiet surface, The Maquis has begun its first small acts of interference with the machinery of occupation. You notice how the work continues without haste. Another bolt loosens. Then another. Each one disappears into the satchel. When the small section of rail has been weakened enough to require repair, the two figures step back from the tracks and walk quietly toward the trees. The railway line remains in place. To anyone passing along the valley road, nothing about the rails would appear unusual. Only when the next train arrives and the engineer notices the slight instability beneath the wheels will the delay begin. Repairs will take time, and time has become one of the most valuable resources the resistance can create. You follow the two figures as they disappear once more among the trees. Their journey back toward the forest ridge will carry the same careful rhythm as the journey that brought them here. No celebration marks the work they have completed. Sabotage within the Maquis often appears almost invisible when viewed from outside. But across the countryside, similar actions are beginning to take place. Telegraph lines quietly cut along remote roads. Road signs turned so that convoys travel the wrong direction. Fuel supplies diverted from storage depots through quiet cooperation with sympathetic workers. Each act small, each one requiring patience rather than spectacle. You watch the railway line resting silently beneath the spring sky. Soon another train will approach from the distant bend where the tracks disappear into the hills. And when it does, the quiet work completed beside the rails this morning will begin to ripple outward through the machinery of war that moves across occupied France. The two figures return to the forest by a longer path than the one they used to reach the railway. Direct routes are avoided whenever possible. Paths that appear too efficient can become patterns, and patterns are easily noticed by those who spend their days searching for signs of unusual movement across the countryside. You watch them move along the edge of a meadow where tall grasses sway beneath the warm breeze of late spring. Their pace remains calm, the same careful rhythm that guided them through the work beside the rails. The satchels at their shoulders appear light again now that the bolts have been removed and scattered separately along the return path, hidden beneath stones or dropped into the stream that crosses the valley. Nothing that might link them to the tracks remains in their possession. These habits have developed slowly within the Maquis. Every action is followed by quiet measures designed to dissolve its traces. The resistance has learned that survival depends not only on what is done, but on how carefully the evidence of that work disappears afterward. The meadow slopes gently toward a line of hedges that separates the open field from a narrow country road. From here the railway line is no longer visible, though the distant sound of metal on metal occasionally drifts across the valley as another train moves somewhere beyond the hills. You pause with them beside the hedgerow. They listen for a moment before crossing. The road appears empty. A cart passes in the distance where a farmer moves slowly between villages with sacks of grain resting beneath a cloth covering. The scene carries the same quiet normality that has defined the countryside since the earliest days of the occupation. Yet hidden within that normality, the work of resistance continues to spread. You notice how the woman who stood watch beside the railway now removes a folded paper from her coat pocket. The message written there will travel to another village before evening arrives. It contains a brief description of the work completed along the rail line. Nothing dramatic. Only a few words confirming that the task was carried out successfully and that the valley route should be avoided for the next several days while railway crews investigate the delay. The message will pass through several hands before reaching the forest again. You follow the two figures as they cross the road and enter the shade of the trees beyond the hedgerow. The forest receives them quietly, its branches filtering the sunlight into soft patterns that move across the ground with the wind. The path climbs gradually toward the ridge. Along the way you notice small signs of the life that has grown here during the past year. A branch trimmed to mark the turn toward a hidden trail. a flat stone placed beside the path where couriers sometimes rest during long journeys between villages. These markers appear meaningless to those who do not know their purpose. But for the Maquis they form a language of quiet guidance. When the two figures reach the clearing near the ridge, the others gather slowly around them. No loud questions are asked. Instead, the satchels are placed beside the fire pit and opened carefully while the story of the morning's journey unfolds in calm voices. The loosened bolts, the quiet valley, the farmer working his field nearby. Each detail becomes part of the shared memory that allows the network to understand what has occurred beyond the forest. You watch the group listen without celebration. Sabotage in the Maquis rarely brings moments of triumph. Its purpose lies not in spectacle, but in persistence. Each delay created along a railway line forces the occupation authorities to spend time and resources repairing what has been quietly undone. And time, as always, remains the most valuable ally of those who resist. The woman who carried the confirmation message places the folded paper inside the tin box where other notes rest briefly before they are burned. The information will travel onward through memory instead of ink. Nearby, another courier prepares to leave the clearing. Her bicycle waits hidden among the trees where a narrow trail leads toward the valley road. She will carry the next message through a chain of villages that have learned to pass information through ordinary gestures. Purchases at market stalls, visits to farms, quiet conversations beside wells and bakeries. You watch her adjust the satchel across her shoulder before stepping onto the path. The network continues its work, not through grand movements or open confrontation, but through hundreds of small actions carried quietly across the countryside. Behind her, the clearing settles into the same steady rhythm that has sustained the Maquis through months of waiting. Someone gathers branches for the fire pit. Another checks the medical supplies stored beneath the crate. A man kneels beside a rough map drawn in the soil, tracing the roads that connect the villages scattered across the hills. The forest listens as the group continues its quiet preparations. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a train approaches the weakened section of track where the bolts were removed earlier that morning. Its engine will slow as the driver notices the instability beneath the wheels. Workers will arrive to inspect the rails, their tools clanging softly against the metal as they search for the cause of the delay. And while they work, the countryside will continue moving. Bicycles along the roads, farmers in the fields, women carrying baskets through village squares where soldiers still linger beside their trucks. Each movement part of a quiet landscape where resistance has learned to blend with the ordinary life surrounding it. The forest holds the clearing in its calm embrace as afternoon fades slowly toward evening. And beneath the branches, the Maquis continues its patient work of interference, shaping the war in small ways that echo far beyond the hills where the first bolts were loosened beside the railway line. The villages that remember. By early summer, the countryside carries the weight of many quiet months. The wheat in the valleys has grown tall enough to ripple like water when the wind moves across the fields. Orchards are heavy with leaves, their branches casting deep shade across the narrow roads where bicycles continue passing between villages. At first glance, the landscape appears almost untouched by the conflict unfolding across Europe. But the people who live here have begun to notice how much has changed beneath that calm surface. You watch the morning unfold in a village square where market stalls are being arranged beneath a row of chestnut trees. Farmers arrive with baskets of vegetables gathered from nearby fields. Women unfold cloth bundles filled with bread and jars of preserved fruit prepared months earlier during the winter. The voices drifting through the square sound familiar. Conversations about weather, about harvests, about the difficulty of finding cooking oil under rationing. Yet between these ordinary exchanges, quieter observations pass through the crowd. Someone mentions that soldiers searched a farm 2 valleys away earlier that week. Another recalls hearing trains moving through the railway station late at night, when the platforms usually stand empty. No one raises their voice while speaking about such things. Instead, the information moves gently through the square like a current beneath still water. You notice how many of the women standing near the stalls listen carefully, without interrupting the flow of conversation. Their presence within the market has always been part of village life. They gather news as naturally as they gather vegetables or bread. But now their listening carries deeper purpose. You follow one of them as she leaves the square carrying a basket balanced against her hip. Inside the basket rests a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth and several onions purchased from a nearby stall. Beneath the vegetables lies a folded message written on thin paper. The message contains only a few lines. Information gathered through the quiet conversations of the morning. 2 trucks seen near the river bridge before dawn. A patrol moving through the southern road at unusual hours. A rumor that railway workers in a neighboring town have begun noticing additional trains passing through the valley each night. None of these details alone appears dramatic. Yet together they form a picture that continues to grow clearer with each passing week. The countryside is changing. You walk beside the woman as she leaves the village and follows the road that curves gently toward the hills. The air carries the scent of warm grass and freshly turned soil where farmers prepare fields for the coming harvest. Behind her, the village continues its ordinary rhythm. Children chase one another near the well. A cart rattles slowly across the square. A soldier stands beside a truck parked near the cafe, smoking a cigarette while watching the quiet movement of market day. Nothing about the scene reveals the hidden network of observation passing quietly through these streets. But the villagers remember. They remember the first days of occupation when soldiers arrived suddenly along the roads. They remember the notices posted beside church doors announcing curfews and rationing. And now they remember the small acts of resistance that have grown gradually through the countryside. Messages carried along the roads, supplies delivered quietly to the forests, railway lines delayed through patient sabotage. You notice how the woman's pace remains steady as she rides the bicycle waiting beside the edge of the road. Her journey will take her toward a farm beyond the hills, where the message will pass into another pair of hands before continuing toward the forest ridge. The route has been traveled many times during the past year, but something about the countryside feels different now. The conversations in the village square carried a quiet sense of expectation. The trains passing through the valley grow more frequent. The soldiers appear more watchful. Even the farmers standing in their fields seem to study the horizon with greater attention than before. You follow the bicycle as it rolls along the narrow road where tall grass leans gently toward the gravel path. The countryside spreads wide beneath the summer sky, calm and open as it has always been. Yet beneath that calm the memory of countless small journeys continues to shape the land. The roads remember the wheels that have carried messages between villages. The hedgerows remember the footsteps of couriers who crossed the fields at dawn. And the people who live here remember the quiet work that has unfolded beneath the surface of everyday life. The woman reaches the crest of a low hill and pauses beside a stone wall where the road begins descending toward the valley beyond. From here, the railway line can be seen faintly in the distance, cutting through the fields beside the river, where trains continue moving day and night along their quiet path through occupied France. She watches the tracks for a moment. Another train passes slowly through the valley. The countryside has begun to count these movements carefully, not because the villagers wish to interfere with every train that passes, but because they sense that something larger may soon move along these rails. The wind carries the distant sound of the engine across the fields, and for a moment the woman stands beside her bicycle listening to the quiet countryside that has learned to remember. The train continues its slow passage through the valley, the sound of its wheels echoing faintly across the fields before dissolving into the warm air of early summer. From the hill where she stands, the woman watches the long line of freight cars move beside the river, their dark shapes sliding steadily along the track. Nothing about the train appears unusual. Yet the countryside has begun to notice how often these journeys occur. You watch the woman place her hat back onto her head before guiding the bicycle down the road that slopes gently toward the valley. The stone wall beside her fades into the tall grass as the path curves between hedgerows that have grown thick with summer leaves. Her journey continues with the same quiet rhythm that has carried messages across these hills for more than a year. But now the roads themselves feel more alert. The villagers who stand beside their gardens observe the passing bicycles with a deeper understanding than before. Farmers working their fields glance toward the railway line when trains move through the valley. Even the children who play near the wells of the village squares have begun to notice the trucks that appear more often along the main roads. The countryside has learned to watch. You follow the bicycle as it reaches the narrow bridge that crosses the small stream beneath the hill. The water flows gently between stones polished smooth by years of steady movement. A wooden railing runs along the edge of the bridge where moss grows thick in the shade. The woman pauses briefly before crossing. She listens. This habit has become instinct for those who travel the roads carrying messages for the Maquis. The quiet countryside offers many signals if one learns how to hear them. Today the valley remains calm. No truck engines approach along the distant road. No soldiers stand near the bridge where patrols sometimes appear without warning. Only the soft rush of water beneath the stones fills the air. Satisfied, she rides across. The path beyond the bridge leads toward a farm where the next quiet exchange will take place. The farmhouse stands beside a grove of apple trees whose branches droop beneath the weight of early fruit. A dog lifts its head from the shade as the bicycle approaches, but does not bark. Recognition travels silently through places like this. The woman dismounts near the wooden gate and rests the bicycle against the fence. A farmer emerges from the barn carrying a sack of grain over his shoulder. He greets her with a nod that carries the quiet familiarity of many previous meetings. Neither speaks immediately. Instead, the farmer sets the sack down beside the fence and wipes his hands on a cloth. The woman removes the loaf of bread from her basket and places it on the wooden rail. Beneath the cloth wrapping rests the folded message gathered earlier in the village square. The farmer lifts the bread slowly. His fingers find the thin paper hidden beneath the linen. For a moment he studies the fields beyond the fence before unfolding the message where the shade of the apple trees hides the movement from distant eyes. He reads the lines carefully. Trucks near the river bridge. Night trains increasing along the valley line. Villagers noticing the same quiet pattern. When he finishes, the paper disappears into the pocket of his coat. You notice how the farmer remains still for several seconds, studying the horizon beyond the fields. The information he carries will travel farther before the day ends. Someone from the farm will walk the forest path at dusk, delivering the message to those waiting beneath the ridge where the Maquis shelters its growing numbers. For now, however, the exchange remains as simple as it appears. The farmer thanks her for the bread. In return, he places a small basket of apples into the bicycle's front carrier, a gesture that appears no different from the countless acts of neighborly exchange that shape rural life. The woman nods once before lifting the bicycle and turning back toward the road. You follow her as she rides away from the farm. The countryside stretches quietly beneath the afternoon sun. In the distance, the railway line gleams faintly beside the river, where another train will soon appear, carrying cargo toward destinations that remain hidden beyond the hills. The villages continue their daily routines. Markets gather each week beneath the chestnut trees. Farmers harvest their crops. Children chase one another along dusty roads where bicycles pass between villages as they always have. Yet beneath these familiar rhythms, the countryside now carries a shared memory. The memory of quiet resistance, of messages folded inside bread and baskets, of women traveling the roads with calm expressions while carrying the fragile lifeline that connects village and forest. You watch the bicycle disappear beyond the curve of the road. The wind moves softly through the tall grass beside the hedgerows. The distant sound of a church bell drifts across the valley as the afternoon slowly approaches evening. And the countryside, patient and watchful, continues remembering the countless small journeys that have shaped its quiet role in the long resistance of the Maquis. The day the roads filled. The change begins not in the forest, but in the villages. At first it arrives as a rumor carried through the quiet spaces where people have learned to speak carefully. Someone hears a broadcast through a hidden radio late at night. Another learns from a railway worker that trains have begun moving equipment south instead of north. A farmer returning from market mentions that soldiers in a nearby town appear unusually tense, speaking quickly among themselves beside their trucks. None of these signs alone reveals the full story. But the countryside has spent many months learning how to listen. You stand once again in the village square beneath the chestnut trees where market stalls once gathered each week. The day is warm now, the summer sun rising slowly above the rooftops, while the early morning air carries the smell of bread from the bakery at the corner of the street. A small group has gathered near the well. Their conversation remains quiet, but something about the rhythm of their voices has changed. The careful tone used during the long months of occupation now carries a hint of urgency. A woman emerges from the bakery holding a loaf wrapped in brown paper. She pauses beside the group and listens while someone explains what they heard during the night. Allied forces have landed somewhere across the sea. No one speaks the name of the place with certainty yet. Only that ships were seen along the coast. That fighting has begun. That the war which once seemed distant may finally be moving toward the countryside. The woman listens carefully before nodding once. Then she begins walking toward the edge of the village, where her bicycle waits beside the stone wall. You follow her along the road that leads toward the hills. The countryside looks unchanged beneath the bright sky. Wheat fields sway gently in the wind, and farmers work quietly beside the hedgerows where summer growth has thickened the branches. Yet the roads carry more travelers today than usual. Bicycles appear at intervals along the path. Some riders move toward neighboring villages. Others travel toward farms where conversations like the one in the square are spreading quietly from one household to another. The network that spent months carrying small observations now carries something larger. News. You watch the woman ride steadily along the narrow lane that climbs toward the ridge where the forest begins. Her satchel rests lightly against her side, but inside there is no folded message today. Instead, she carries the memory of the conversation from the village square. This is how news moves fastest through the countryside. Not through paper, but through voices. You notice the way the road grows busier as she approaches the small bridge that crosses the stream beneath the hill. Two other cyclists arrive from the opposite direction, their expressions calm but focused. They greet her briefly before continuing toward the village she just left. None of them stops long enough to explain. They do not need to. The countryside has already begun to understand. When she reaches the edge of the forest path, she dismounts and lifts the bicycle onto her shoulder for the short climb along the narrow trail that leads beneath the trees. The branches close quietly behind her as she disappears into the shade where the Maquis has spent so many months waiting. The clearing appears much as it did during the long winter. Shelters remain low against the ground. The fire pit rests beneath a ring of stones. but the air feels different. You watch as several figures gather when she enters the clearing. No one asks immediately why she has come so early in the day. Instead, they wait while she catches her breath and looks around the small circle of faces that have shared the forest through seasons of waiting. Then she speaks quietly. The news travels through the clearing in a single sentence. Allied forces have landed. For a moment, the forest seems to hold its breath. The people standing beneath the branches have spent months preparing for this possibility without knowing when it might arrive. Messages from distant networks hinted that such a day would come eventually, but the exact moment remained uncertain. Now the moment has begun. You watch the group absorb the news slowly. No sudden cheers. No raised voices. Instead, the silence deepens as each person considers what the words might mean. If the landings are real, the war that once seemed far away across the sea will soon move across the countryside itself. German forces stationed in towns and cities throughout France will begin shifting their positions. Roads that once carried quiet patrols may soon fill with convoys moving toward the coast, and the Maquis will no longer remain only observers. The forest listens as the group begins speaking softly among themselves. Some discuss the railway lines that cross the valleys below. Others mention the bridges where German trucks often pass on their way toward the main roads. The quiet acts of sabotage carried out during previous months suddenly carry new meaning. Time has changed. The roads will soon fill. But for now, the clearing remains calm beneath the summer sky. The woman who brought the news sits beside the fallen trunk where she once waited during the early days of the Maquis. Her bicycle rests nearby against a tree, the same bicycle that carried messages through villages during the long months when resistance meant patience more than action. Today, it has carried something else. The first clear signal that the waiting may soon end. For several minutes after the news is spoken, the clearing remains quiet. Not the quiet of uncertainty that once filled the long winter days, but a different stillness, the kind that settles over people who understand that something they have prepared for is finally beginning to unfold. The forest holds the moment gently beneath its branches, as though allowing the weight of the news to settle before the next movement begins. You watch the small group gather closer beside the fallen trunk. The woman who carried the message from the village sits with her hands resting on the handlebars of the bicycle. The others listen while she repeats the few details she heard in the square. The radio broadcast, the rumor spreading through neighboring towns, the tension she noticed among the soldiers standing near their trucks. No one yet knows exactly where the landings have taken place. But the countryside understands enough. The war that once seemed distant has begun to shift toward France itself. You notice how the conversation slowly turns toward the roads. The men and women who have spent months watching the countryside now begin recalling the patterns they have observed through the long seasons of resistance. Which bridges carry the heaviest truck traffic? Which railway crossings lie along the routes used by German convoys? Which villages host the garrisons that might soon move toward the coast? These details have been collected patiently for more than a year. Now they begin to form something like a map. One of the men kneels beside the fire pit and draws a rough outline in the soil with a small stick. The line of the river appears first, followed by the road that winds through the valley toward the larger town beyond the hills. You watch as others add small marks to the drawing. A bridge near the southern road. A narrow railway crossing where trains slow before entering the valley. A crossroads where patrol trucks often stop beside the cafe. Each mark represents a place that has been quietly observed during countless journeys through the countryside. The forest listens while the group studies the rough map. Their voices remain calm, but the tone has changed. The conversations that once focused on survival, food supplies, safe travel routes, shelter repairs, now turn toward something else. Interruption. Delay. Movement. If German forces begin traveling toward the coast in response to the landings, the roads and railways crossing these valleys will become their pathways. And pathways can be slowed. You watch the woman who carried the news glance toward the path leading back down the ridge. She understands that the villages will soon carry this same conversation. Farmers listening beside their fields. Railway workers standing near the platforms where trains continue passing through the countryside. Women gathering at markets where quiet exchanges of information have sustained the resistance from the beginning. The entire countryside has been watching. Now the watching must become something more. Yet the group in the clearing does not rush. Instead, they return briefly to the quiet discipline that shaped the Maquis through the long months of waiting. The map drawn in the soil is studied carefully before being erased with the sole of a boot. The fire pit is covered again with ash to prevent smoke from rising above the trees. Preparation continues even in the presence of new urgency. You notice how the woman stands and lifts the bicycle once more. Her journey back to the villages must begin soon. The news she carries will travel quickly along the same roads that have supported the network since the early days of occupation. But now those roads will carry something else. Not just messages. Purpose. You follow her as she steps onto the forest path and begins descending the ridge. Behind her, the clearing settles briefly into silence again, though the air feels charged with quiet anticipation. The forest has sheltered the Maquis through seasons of patience. Now it prepares to release that patience into the wider countryside. When she reaches the edge of the trees, the valley spreads before her beneath the late afternoon sun. The railway line glints faintly beside the river, where another train moves slowly through the fields. The roads that cross the countryside appear peaceful from this height. But the people who know them understand that the days ahead will change their meaning. You watch the bicycle roll onto the narrow lane that leads toward the village. Along the road she passes several other riders moving quickly between farms and neighboring towns. Their expressions carry the same quiet focus she felt in the clearing above. The countryside is beginning to move. Farmers glance toward the railway line as trains pass. Villagers gather beside radios hidden behind closed curtains. Messengers travel the roads with renewed urgency. The long waiting has ended, and as the sun begins to sink behind the hills, the roads of rural France start to fill with the quiet motion of a resistance that has finally heard the signal it has been preparing for all along. The first days after the news move quickly through the countryside. Not in sudden bursts of noise, but through a steady increase in motion that spreads from village to village. Roads that once carried only the quiet rhythm of farm carts and bicycles now hold longer lines of trucks moving toward the larger towns. German soldiers appear more frequently along the crossroads where they pause to study maps spread across the hoods of their vehicles. The countryside watches. It has spent many months learning how to observe without drawing attention, and now those habits sharpen further. Farmers working in the fields notice which roads the trucks prefer. Railway workers count the trains that pass through their stations each night. Women standing beside market stalls hear fragments of hurried conversation between soldiers who no longer seem as calm as before. You stand beside the road leading from the village toward the forest ridge. Dust rises behind a column of vehicles moving slowly through the valley. The engines echo faintly against the hills as the convoy disappears around a distant bend. The villagers standing nearby say little, but their silence carries understanding. You watch a woman step away from the edge of the road and move quickly toward the narrow path that leads into the forest. Her bicycle rolls beside her across the field where tall grass bends beneath the summer wind. Inside her satchel rests a small message written only moments earlier. 3 trucks passed toward the northern road. A train carrying equipment left the station before dawn. More soldiers arriving in the town beyond the hills. The information will travel quickly now. You follow her along the forest path as she climbs toward the ridge where the Maquis waits beneath the trees. The air beneath the canopy feels cooler than the valley below, though the forest itself seems to carry a quiet tension that was not present during the long months of winter. The clearing appears almost unchanged. Shelters remain low against the ground. The fire pit rests beneath its ring of stones. But the people gathered here move with greater purpose now. You watch as the woman enters the clearing and places the folded message beside the fire pit. The group gathers quickly, reading the lines in silence before passing the paper from hand to hand. Outside the forest, the war is beginning to shift. German forces are moving, and the Maquis can see the roads where those movements must pass. You notice how the group studies the map drawn once again in the soil beside the fire pit. The stick traces the familiar lines of the valley roads and railway crossings that have been watched for months. But now the marks appear more frequently. Bridges, road junctions, telephone lines that run beside the highway connecting the town to the larger cities beyond the hills. Each place has been observed quietly during the long year of resistance. Now those observations begin to guide action. You follow two figures as they step away from the clearing and gather several tools from a wooden crate hidden beneath branches. A pair of wire cutters, a wrench, a length of rope used for climbing the wooden poles that carry telephone lines across the countryside. These tools have rested unused for many weeks. Now they will travel beyond the forest. You walk beside them as they descend the path toward the valley, where the road bends beside a row of telegraph poles standing evenly along the roadside. The wires stretch from pole to pole, carrying the constant hum of communication between towns and military headquarters. For months the Maquis has listened. Now it begins to interrupt. The two figures stop near the base of one of the poles where tall grass hides their movements from the road. One of them climbs carefully, gripping the wooden surface with practiced ease, while the other stands watch beneath the branches. The wind moves softly through the leaves overhead. You hear the faint scrape of metal as the wire cutters close around the line. A moment later the wire falls loose, swaying gently between the poles. No loud noise marks the act. The countryside remains calm. But somewhere beyond the hills, a telephone receiver will soon fall silent. The message traveling along that line will stop. And the quiet work of interruption that the Maquis prepared for through long months of observation will continue spreading across the roads and railways of occupied France. You watch the two figures step back into the trees where the forest closes around them once more. The work has begun, but the forest remains patient. It has learned that even when action begins, it must move with the same quiet discipline that allowed the resistance to grow unseen through the long seasons of waiting. The cut wire swings gently in the wind for several seconds before settling into stillness. From the road below, nothing immediately appears different. The line still stretches from pole to pole across the valley, its dark shape blending into the pale sky above the fields. Only when someone lifts a telephone receiver in a distant town will the interruption become clear. You watch the two figures return quietly toward the forest path. Their movements remain calm, almost unremarkable. The tools disappear back into the satchel. Footsteps fall softly against the grass as they slip once more beneath the trees where the ridge rises toward the Maquis encampment. This quiet rhythm of action will repeat itself across the countryside during the coming days, not through sudden attacks, but through hundreds of small interruptions. You follow them along the narrow trail that winds upward through the forest. Sunlight flickers between the branches, casting shifting patterns across the ground as the wind moves gently through the leaves. The clearing appears ahead much as it did before they left. A small group waits beside the fire pit, listening for the sound of returning footsteps. When the two figures step into the open space, a few quiet nods pass between them. No celebration marks the moment. The work is simply added to the growing list of tasks carried out across the valleys and hills. The satchel is opened. The wire cutters returned to the crate. Another folded message prepared for the next courier traveling toward the villages. You notice how the map appears again in the soil beside the fire pit. The stick traces familiar lines across the earth, while the group studies the roads leading toward the towns beyond the hills. Each mark represents a place where movement might be slowed. A narrow bridge where trucks must pass single file. A railway junction where trains often wait before continuing their journey. A stretch of road bordered by steep embankments where fallen trees could block the path. The Maquis has spent many months learning the shape of the countryside. Now that knowledge begins to guide the quiet work of resistance. You watch a woman step forward and add another mark to the map. She describes the convoy she saw earlier that morning while standing near the edge of the village square. 3 trucks carrying equipment toward the northern road. Soldiers speaking hurriedly beside their vehicles as they studied maps in the bright morning light. The information settles into the group's understanding. German forces are moving quickly now. But movement requires roads, and roads can be interrupted. You notice how the conversation remains measured despite the urgency building beyond the forest. Each suggestion is considered carefully, each route examined in light of what has already been observed through months of patient watching. The forest listens while these plans take shape. Birdsong drifts softly through the branches above the clearing. A breeze moves across the ridge carrying the scent of warm earth and summer leaves. From somewhere beyond the hills, the faint sound of an engine echoes briefly across the valley before fading into the distance. The war has begun to move closer. Yet inside the forest, the Maquis continues its quiet discipline. The map drawn in the soil is studied once more before being erased with the sole of a boot. No trace of the conversation remains visible when the ground is smoothed again beneath the fallen leaves. Preparation continues. A courier lifts a satchel and checks the messages folded inside. Another person gathers rope and tools that will travel toward a bridge farther down the valley before nightfall. Nearby, the woman who carried the morning's news sits beside the fallen trunk, watching the forest path that leads back toward the villages. She understands that the countryside itself has begun to move. Farmers watch the roads while tending their fields. Railway workers count the trains passing through their stations. Women gather information beside market stalls where soldiers no longer speak as confidently as before. Each observation travels quietly toward the forest, and from the forest, small acts of interruption spread outward in response. You follow the courier as she steps onto the path, descending the ridge once again. The satchel rests lightly against her side, carrying messages that will travel through villages and farms before nightfall. The road below appears peaceful beneath the wide summer sky. But the people who know these roads understand that the quiet landscape has begun to change. The forest has stepped forward, and across the countryside of occupied France, the patient work of resistance continues to unfold. One cut wire, one blocked road, one delayed train at a time. The paths that remain. Long after the war has moved beyond the hills, the forest remains. The ridge still rises above the valleys where wheat fields return each summer to their quiet rhythm beneath the sun. The narrow paths that once carried careful footsteps between shelters and clearings remain faintly visible among the trees, though the branches have grown thicker over the years and moss has softened the ground where many once walked in silence. You stand at the edge of the clearing where the Maquis waited through those long seasons of occupation. The shelters are gone now. The fire pit has filled slowly with soil and fallen leaves. Only the shape of the land hints that people once gathered here beneath the branches, listening to the distant sounds of a war that seemed both far away and very close at the same time. The forest has returned to its ordinary life. Birds move between the branches where new leaves unfold each spring. Streams continue their quiet descent toward the valleys. Wind passes through the trees with the same patient voice it carried long before the first messenger arrived along the ridge. Yet the land remembers, not through monuments or markers carved into stone, but through the quiet knowledge held by the villages that surround these hills. You watch the road leading toward the valley where bicycles once carried messages between farms and market squares. Today the road is calm again. A tractor moves slowly through a nearby field. Children ride bicycles along the same narrow lanes where couriers once traveled beneath the watchful eyes of occupation patrols. The countryside breathes differently now. The tension that once lingered along the roads has faded into memory. The railway line beside the river carries ordinary trains once again, their wheels echoing softly across the fields as they pass through stations that no longer watch the horizon for military convoys. But beneath that calm surface, the quiet history of those months remains woven into the land. Women who once carried messages hidden inside baskets or loaves of bread returned to their villages when the war moved onward. Many resumed the ordinary lives they had paused for a time, working in markets, tending farms, raising families in the same houses that had sheltered their quiet acts of resistance. The forest released them slowly. Its paths grew silent again as the shelters disappeared and the tools of sabotage were set aside. The ridge returned to the patient stillness that had always defined it. Yet those who lived through those seasons understood something about the countryside that had not been visible before. They understood how ordinary landscapes can become places of quiet courage, how a village square can carry whispers that travel farther than written orders, how a bicycle rolling along a narrow road can sustain a network strong enough to outlast the watchful presence of an occupying army. You look across the valley where the railway line still glints faintly beside the river. Trains move peacefully now, their cargo no longer shaped by war. The bridges remain standing. The telephone poles continue carrying lines that hum softly with everyday communication. But once, in the quiet years of occupation, those same rails and roads carried a different meaning. They became the pathways where patience turned into resistance, where women moving through ordinary routines quietly shaped the course of events unfolding across the wider war. The forest remembers those footsteps even if it no longer shows their traces. You stand beneath the trees where the wind moves gently through the leaves. The branches whisper the same sound they carried decades ago when the Maquis waited in silence beneath the ridge. The world beyond the hills has changed many times since then. Nations rebuilt. Borders shifted. Generations passed through the villages where those quiet journeys once began. But the paths remain. And somewhere within the quiet rhythm of wind and leaf, the memory of those women still moves through the forest, steady as the turning wheels of a bicycle along a country road that once carried the fragile lifeline of resistance through occupied France. You've been part of echoes of war, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.